There is something about the deep ocean that has always felt like a place beyond ordinary thought, a place where the mind can wander without edges, without walls, without any sense of where one thing ends and another begins. It begins, as all great journeys do, with water. Not the shallow sunlit water of tide pools or quiet shorelines, but something far older, far deeper, far more vast than anything the eye can measure from the surface. The ocean, in its truest form, is not blue. It is black, a darkness so complete, so absolute, that light itself, that restless, curious thing, eventually surrenders, gives up its reach, and lets the dark take over. Somewhere in that darkness, something moves. It does not rush. It does not startle or scatter like the creatures of the shallows do. It drifts, in a sense, though that word is almost too small, too gentle for what it is. It moves with intention, with a kind of slow, deliberate grace that belongs entirely to itself, 10 arms arranged in careful symmetry, 2 enormous eyes catching what little light exists in a world that has almost none, a body the length of a school bus or longer, trailing into the dim like something half-imagined. This is the giant squid, Architeuthis ducks, if one wishes to be precise about it, and there is a quiet pleasure in that precision, in letting a name like that settle on the tongue. Architeuthis, from the Greek, meaning ruling squid or chief squid, depending on how one leans. A name given by scientists who had never seen one living, never watched one move through open water, who knew this creature only in pieces, only in fragments washed ashore or torn from the bellies of sperm whales, and still somehow they chose a name that fit, because there is something regal about it, something that commands. Even now, knowing what we know, and we know more than we once did, though still so much less than we might like, the giant squid retains a quality of mystery so deep it feels almost sacred. It is not an animal that has been fully understood, catalogued, explained away. It is an animal that continues to surprise, to resist easy knowing, to exist on its own terms in a world we can barely visit and cannot truly inhabit. And that, perhaps, is where the wonder begins. The ocean covers roughly 71% of the surface of this planet. 71%, and yet the vast majority of it, the deep, cold, lightless regions below 1,000 meters, remains largely unexplored. The deep ocean is, in many ways, the last true wilderness on Earth, a place where pressures become incomprehensible, where temperatures hover near freezing, where the weight of an entire ocean presses down in every direction with a force that would crush most living things into nothing. And yet life persists there, quietly, stubbornly, in forms that seem to belong to a different imagination entirely. The giant squid is one of those forms. It lives primarily in the mesopelagic and bathypelagic zones, what oceanographers call the twilight zone and the midnight zone, those vast vertically layered regions of the water column that stretch from roughly 200 meters down to 1,000 meters and beyond. These are not places that announce themselves. They have no landmarks, no seasons in any traditional sense, no sunrises or sunsets, only a slow, gradual dimming as one descends, a fading of the last blue frequencies of light, until even that fades and there is only dark. To think about that darkness for a moment is to understand something essential about the giant squid. It was shaped by this place. Every aspect of its extraordinary body, Its size, its eyes, its arms, its nervous system is in some way an answer to the questions this environment asks. How do you find food in a place where you cannot see? How do you avoid predators in a place with no shadows to hide in? How do you navigate a world defined not by landmarks, but by pressure, by temperature, by the faintest gradients of chemistry in the water around you? The giant squid has spent millions of years working out those answers, and the answers, it turns out, are remarkable. But there is no hurry to arrive at them all at once. The deep ocean teaches patience in its way. Things down there do not move at the pace of the surface world. Seasons slow, heartbeats slow. Even time itself seems to stretch, to become something more elastic, more forgiving, when there is no light to mark its passing. So we will follow the ocean's example tonight. We will move slowly. We will let the details come one at a time, like bioluminescent sparks drifting upward through still water, each one arriving gently, illuminating something small, something true, before fading back into the dark. There is a particular feeling that comes when one thinks deeply about an animal like this, a creature so remote from ordinary experience that imagining it requires a certain kind of letting go of the familiar, of the terrestrial, the lit, the known, and allowing the mind to stretch downward as if it, too, could descend through all those fathoms of cold water, passing through the thermocline where warm meets cold, through the layer where the last green light dissolves, deeper still, until the only sensations are pressure and silence, and the occasional impossible glow of some creature passing in the dark. Down there, in that immensity, the giant squid waits. It has not always been known, this creature. For most of human history, the giant squid existed only at the very edge of understanding, glimpsed in fragments, described in myths, dismissed by serious minds as the fevered imagination of sailors who had spent too long at sea. And yet the sailors were not wrong. The ancient Norse had a name for it, or something like it. They called it the kraken, a word that carries within it a kind of weight, a heaviness, as if the very sound of it is meant to suggest something vast and submerged. Medieval Scandinavian fishermen spoke of a creature so enormous that when it rose to the surface it could be mistaken for an island. Men had reportedly landed on its back, built fires, begun to make camp, before the thing shifted and sank back into the sea, taking everything with it. These were stories, of course, embellishments, exaggerations, the natural human tendency to make the unknown larger than it already is. But beneath every great myth, there tends to be a seed of something real. And the seed, in this case, was genuine. Something was out there. The earliest written accounts that seem to describe something resembling a giant squid come from ancient Greece. Aristotle, that tireless, meticulous observer of the natural world, wrote in the 4th century before the Common Era about a creature he called teuthus, distinguishing it from the smaller teuthus, suggesting he understood that different sizes of these animals existed. He described a large squid with proportions unlike the ordinary ones seen in Mediterranean waters. Whether Aristotle had encountered a true giant squid specimen or simply heard reports of one from fishermen who worked deeper waters is impossible to say now, but the observation was recorded, preserved, passed forward through centuries of scholarship, like a message in a bottle. Other ancient writers added their own fragments. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, described a creature he called a polypus of extraordinary size, with arms as thick as a man's thigh and a head as large as a barrel, that had been raiding the salt fish stores of merchants in Cartia near the Strait of Gibraltar. Pliny was not always a careful naturalist by modern standards, and his accounts blend the credible with the fantastical in ways that make separation difficult. But the specificity of the detail is striking. The location, the behavior, the physical description, these are not the gestures of pure myth-making. They feel in some way like testimony. Centuries passed. The creature retreated back into legend. The medieval period did not add much clarity to the question of what the giant squid actually was. What it did add was atmosphere. The kraken grew in the telling, swelling through the literature of Scandinavian seafarers until it became something almost cosmological, a creature of the deep that represented the ocean's capacity for absolute, annihilating power. The 13th century Old Norse text known as the Konungs Skuggsja, the king's mirror, described a creature in the waters off Greenland that was so enormous it could not be given a clear account of its size. It was said to swallow fish by exhaling a kind of sweetness into the water, drawing them inward in clouds. When it submerged, the whirlpool created by its descent could pull ships to their doom. There is something beautiful in an unsettling way about how the imagination scaled up to meet the unknown. The ocean was so large, so impenetrable, that the creatures within it had to be proportionally immense. The kraken was not simply an animal. It was an answer to the question of what lives in a place that large. It was the ocean personified as appetite. But the ocean was, slowly, beginning to yield its evidence. Carcasses began appearing on European beaches with more regularity in the 19th century. And this, more than any prior century, is when the story of the giant squid shifts from myth to science. The early 1800s brought with them a new spirit of systematic inquiry, a belief that the natural world could be catalogued, classified, understood, that even its most extreme productions could be brought under the lamp of careful observation. In 1853, a large mass of tissue washed ashore on the coast of Jutland in Denmark. It was initially puzzling, formless, decomposed, difficult to identify. But a Danish zoologist named Japetus Steenstrup examined it carefully and concluded that it was the remains of a giant cephalopod of a kind not previously described in the scientific literature. He named it Architeuthis monachus, the monk squid, a name whose origins have been debated. Some say it referred to the cowl-like appearance of the mantle. Others suggest other origins entirely. But the name that would endure, the name most commonly used today, would come a little later, Architeuthis dux, Architeuthis, the ruling squid. Steenstrup was a careful, methodical man, and his work on this specimen was the first genuine attempt to describe the giant squid as a real biological entity rather than a legendary one. He published his findings and argued, patiently and against some skepticism, that this was not a sea monster but an animal, a cephalopod, related to the ordinary squid of the shallows, scaled up to a size that seemed improbable, but was nonetheless factual. The scientific community was not entirely persuaded all at once. It rarely is. But the evidence continued to accumulate. In the 1860s and 1870s, a remarkable series of strandings occurred, primarily along the coasts of Newfoundland, in Canada, and in coastal waters of the North Atlantic. that brought multiple specimens to the attention of naturalists. These were not fragments or impressions, but actual animals, whole or nearly so, that could be measured, described, illustrated. One of the most significant early specimens arrived in 1873 off the coast of Conception Bay in Newfoundland. Two fishermen, Daniel Squires and Theophilus Picot, encountered a large mass floating at the surface, which they initially took for debris or perhaps the remains of a whale. When they prodded it with a boat hook, it came alive. Two enormous arms whipped toward the boat. The men scrambled, and one of them, accounts vary on exactly who, used a hatchet to sever the arms that had wrapped around the boat's side. They brought the severed arms back to shore. Those arms eventually came to the attention of a Reverend Moses Harvey, a clergyman and amateur naturalist in Newfoundland who had been quietly following reports of large cephalopod strandings in the region with intense interest. Harvey recognized their significance immediately and secured them for examination. He also, in the months that followed, managed to obtain a more complete specimen, one of the most famous in the early history of giant squid science, which he photographed draped over a tub in his bathroom, an image that became one of the earliest photographic records of the animal. There is something endearing about that image. A giant squid, one of the most mysterious creatures on earth, arranged in a Victorian clergyman's bathroom for a photograph. It captures something true about the history of natural science in that era. The way discovery happened not always in grand institutions with vast resources, but often in the hands of curious, passionate individuals who found extraordinary things in ordinary circumstances and simply refused to let them go unexamined. Harvey shared his specimens and his observations with the American naturalist Addison Emery Verrill at Yale University, who became one of the first scientists to conduct systematic comparative studies of multiple giant squid specimens. Verrill described and named several species, or what he believed to be several species, and produced detailed anatomical descriptions that formed the backbone of early scientific understanding of the animal. This was a period of extraordinary accumulation. Between roughly 1870 and 1900, more than 50 reasonably well-documented giant squid strandings or encounters were recorded from around the North Atlantic. Each one added something, a measurement here, an observation there, a drawing made by a careful hand before the specimen could deteriorate further. Scientists began to understand for the first time just how large these animals could be. Early measurements had to contend with the difficulty of working with fresh squid tissue, which contracts and deforms rapidly after death. Tentacles stretch, mantles shrink, and a measurement taken an hour after stranding might differ significantly from one taken the day before. But even accounting for these difficulties, the numbers were extraordinary. Mantle lengths, the length of the main body, not including the arms, of 2 meters or more were documented. Total lengths, including the long tentacles, reached estimates of 10, 12, even 15 meters in some accounts, though the most extravagant early figures were likely exaggerated. The animals weighed hundreds of kilograms. Their eyes, even in specimens considerably smaller than the largest reported, were the size of dinner plates, the largest eyes of any animal then known to science. That fact alone, the eyes, tended to stop people in their tracks when they first encountered it. There is something about the eye that invites recognition. It is the feature by which we most readily identify another consciousness, another presence. And the giant squid's eye enormous and complex, structurally not entirely unlike a human eye in its basic organization, lens, retina, iris, cornea, seems to look back at you with an intensity that is difficult to dismiss as merely anatomical. Why does an animal in the deep dark need eyes so large? That question would not be answered for some time. It would require not just the collection of more specimens, but a deeper understanding of the environment those specimens came from. The physics of light in deep water, the biology of bioluminescence, the specific visual challenges posed by a world where photons are precious and predators are enormous. But even then, in those early decades of scientific engagement, when specimens were still being hauled from beaches and measured in fishermen's sheds and clergymen's bathrooms, the question was forming itself quietly at the edge of understanding. Why so large? Why so deep? Why so seldom seen? The giant squid was not merely an animal to be catalogued. It was a question the ocean was asking, slowly, in its own time. And the answer, like the animal itself, was still mostly hidden in the dark. And so the scientists kept asking. They kept collecting, kept measuring, kept pressing their curiosity against the edges of what could be known from specimens alone. The 19th century gave way to the 20th, and with that transition came new tools, new technologies, new ways of reaching toward the deep. And still the giant squid remained elusive, still more rumor than reality in the minds of most people, still something glimpsed at the margins, in the evidence left behind rather than in the living animal itself. Because that was the essential frustration. And it is worth sitting with it for a moment, really feeling the weight of it. All of those strandings, all of those carefully measured arms and photographed mantles and preserved beaks, none of them showed a living giant squid. None of them revealed the animal in its actual context, in its actual world, doing the things that living animals do. What scientists had was anatomy. What they lacked was behavior. And those are very different kinds of knowledge. Knowing the structure of an eye tells you something. But watching that eye move in the dark, tracking something at a distance of 30 meters through water that admits almost no light, that tells you something else entirely, something that anatomy, no matter how carefully observed, cannot fully provide. So the giant squid remained, in a very real sense, a mystery wrapped inside a fact. Its existence was no longer in serious scientific doubt by the early 20th century, but its life, how it hunted, how it moved, how it found mates, how long it lived, what its daily existence in those cold, dark fathoms actually felt like from the inside, all of that remained as dark as the water it inhabited. The anatomy, at least, had begun to be understood in considerable detail. The body of a giant squid is built around a structure called the mantle, a muscular torpedo-shaped tube that houses most of the animal's vital organs. The mantle is both a container and an engine. It draws water in through an opening near the head and then expels it forcefully through a narrow muscular tube called the siphon or hyponome. And that expulsion is the squid's primary means of propulsion, jet propulsion. In the most literal biological sense, the animal aims the siphon, contracts the mantle, and shoots itself through the water in whatever direction the siphon points. It is an ancient system. Cephalopods have been using some version of it for hundreds of millions of years, and it is extraordinarily effective for short bursts of speed or sudden directional changes. Less efficient for sustained long-distance travel, perhaps, but in the deep ocean, Where ambush and quick response matter more than marathon endurance, the jet is precisely what is needed. The giant squid also has two large triangular fins at the posterior end of the mantle. These are not fins in the fish sense, not rigid structures supported by bone, but muscular flaps of tissue that can undulate, can sculpt the water around them, can provide subtle steering and gentle forward movement when the full force of the jet is not required. In slow cruising, these fins do most of the work. In escape or attack, the jet takes over. Then there are the arms, 8 of them, thick and powerful, lined along their inner surfaces with suckers, and those suckers in the giant squid are not simple cups, as they are in many other cephalopods. They are ringed with sharp tooth-like serrations of chitin, the same hard biological material that forms insect exoskeletons, that grip and cut simultaneously. They are, in a very practical sense, 8 arms equipped with circular saws. A prey animal seized by a giant squid is not merely held. It is gripped by dozens of these serrated rings at once, each one biting into flesh, creating purchase that is almost impossible to break. And then there are the 2 tentacles. These are distinct from the arms, longer, more slender along most of their length, but expanded at the ends into flattened club-shaped structures called tentacular clubs, which are also lined with suckers, also armed with those chitinous teeth. The tentacles are the reach of the giant squid, the extending strike. Where the arms hold and manipulate, the tentacles lunge and grab, shooting outward from the cluster with a speed that the deep water does its best to conceal. The exact striking speed of a live giant squid's tentacles has never been directly measured in the wild, but based on the morphology of the muscles involved and observations from related species, it is understood to be extraordinarily fast. Fast enough to snatch a fish or smaller squid before the prey has time to register the threat and begin an escape response. Once captured, prey is brought to the center of the arm crown where the beak waits. The beak of a giant squid is perhaps the most dramatic single feature of the animal's anatomy. If one sets aside the eyes for a moment, it is made entirely of chitin, hard, dark, curved shaped remarkably like the beak of a parrot, with a sharp hooked upper jaw and a broader lower jaw that works against it in a scissoring motion. It is the hardest structure in the squid's body by far, the only part that is truly rigid in a creature that is otherwise almost entirely soft tissue, and this creates one of the stranger facts about giant squid biology. The beak does not decompose at anything like the rate of the surrounding flesh. When a sperm whale eats a giant squid, and sperm whales eat a great many of them, the soft tissue is digested, processed, converted into the whale's own biological currency. But the beaks accumulate. They collect in the whale's stomach, and later in a section of its digestive system in quantities that can number in the hundreds in a single whale. Sperm whale stomachs have been examined and found to contain the beaks of hundreds of individual giant squids, which tells us quietly but unmistakably that sperm whales eat giant squids with a regularity and volume that would have seemed astonishing if the evidence weren't sitting right there, counted out beak by beak. And this brings us to one of the most important ecological relationships in the deep ocean, and one of the primary windows through which scientists have tried for more than a century to understand the giant squid's life. The sperm whale and the giant squid, they are bound together in a predator-prey relationship so intense, so long-standing, so written into the bodies of both animals that it has shaped them both in ways that are still being understood. Sperm whales, the largest toothed predators on Earth, animals that can reach 18 meters in length and dive to depths exceeding 2,000 meters, descend into the darkness specifically to hunt cephalopods, large cephalopods. Giant squid are not merely an occasional prey item for sperm whales. They appear to be a central, possibly dominant component of the deep-diving sperm whale's diet, and the evidence of this relationship is written on the whales themselves. Many sperm whales, when examined closely, hardly bear circular scars on their skin, raised rings of slightly different texture, arranged in clusters that precisely match the dimensions and spacing of giant squid sucker rings. These are not small marks. Some of the circular scars found on large bull sperm whales measure 30 centimeters or more in diameter, which would correspond to a squid sucker of extraordinary size, and by implication an animal of extraordinary size. The largest beaks recovered from sperm whale stomachs suggest animals that, if the beak-to-body size ratio holds, would have been significantly larger than any complete specimen ever physically measured. How much larger is a question that science has not been able to definitively answer, because the soft tissue does not survive. Only the beak endures, patient and hard and silent, waiting to be counted. This raises a possibility that researchers approach with appropriate caution but genuine fascination. The largest giant squids ever captured or stranded may not represent the upper limit of the species' size. There may be individuals in the deep ocean, older, perhaps, or simply more fortunate in their habitat and prey availability, that exceed any measurement in the scientific record. The ocean, as ever, is keeping its own counsel on the matter. Through the early and middle decades of the 20th century, scientific understanding of the giant squid deepened in some respects while remaining frustratingly incomplete in others. Laboratory analysis of preserved specimens revealed more about internal anatomy, the structure of the gladius, the long transparent internal shell that runs the length of the mantle like a ghostly quill, providing structural support without the weight of a true external shell, the complexity of the nervous system with its enormous optic lobes and a brain that, while not large by vertebrate standards, is organized in ways that suggest a degree of sensory processing sophistication appropriate to its extraordinary eyes. The structure of the digestive system, with its curious passage directly through the brain, meaning that in the giant squid, as in all cephalopods, food must pass through the brain on its way to the stomach, which places a strict limit on the size of prey, items that can be swallowed whole. This anatomical detail, the brain surrounding the esophagus like a ring, is one of those facts that rewards quiet contemplation. It is a constraint built into the architecture of the animal, a reminder that every body plan is a set of trade-offs, every evolutionary solution a negotiation between competing demands. The giant squid compensates for this restriction with its beak and with a rasping tongue-like structure called the radula, which works to break food into pieces small enough to pass through that narrow esophageal ring without damage. Together, beak and radula act as a kind of external predigestion, tearing, scraping, reducing prey to manageable portions before any of it enters the digestive tract proper. Meanwhile, researchers were also beginning to piece together, from stranding records and from the geographic distribution of whale feeding grounds, something of the giant squid's global range, it became apparent that Architeuthis dux was not a creature confined to the North Atlantic, where the earliest and most numerous stranding records originated. Specimens had been documented from the waters around New Zealand and Australia, from the South Atlantic, from the coasts of South Africa and the seas around the Falkland Islands, from the waters off Japan and the western North Pacific, even from sub-Antarctic waters, those cold, turbulent seas that circle the lower portion of the globe in a band of near-perpetual motion. The picture that emerged was of an animal with a genuinely global distribution, present in deep oceanic waters across all the world's major ocean basins, from temperate to subpolar latitudes. Not a creature of the tropics, it seemed. The very warmest equatorial waters appeared to be largely absent from its range, but a creature of cold and cool deep water everywhere that such water existed, which on this planet is quite a lot of places. The giant squid was not rare in the sense of being confined to a small territory. It was rare in the sense of being genuinely deep, genuinely remote from the surface world, genuinely difficult to encounter without descending into a part of the ocean that remained, even as human technology advanced through the 20th century, extraordinarily hard to reach and harder still to observe. A creature can be numerous and still be invisible if it lives in a place you cannot go, and this is perhaps one of the most important things to understand about the giant squid, not just as a biological fact, but as a kind of lesson in humility about the limits of human perception. The ocean contains multitudes that we cannot see, populations of large, complex animals living out entire life cycles in the dark, eating and being eaten, growing to remarkable sizes, dying and sinking back into the abyss, all of it unobserved, unrecorded, known only through the indirect testimony of beaks in whale stomachs and scars on whale skin, and the occasional body cast up on a beach by currents that follow their own inscrutable logic. It is a humbling thing to sit with. The world is larger than what can be seen from where we stand. The ocean knows this better than anywhere. And then, in the final decades of the 20th century, something began to shift. The tools available to deep-sea researchers had been improving slowly, steadily, across the decades. But by the 1980s and 1990s, a new generation of technology was beginning to make the genuinely deep ocean more accessible than it had ever been before. Remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, could descend to depths that no human body could survive, carrying cameras and lights and sampling equipment into the permanent dark. Acoustic tags capable of tracking the movements of large marine animals through the water column were becoming smaller and more reliable, and a growing community of researchers drawn by the persistent mystery of the giant squid was beginning to coordinate their efforts in ways that the earlier, more isolated naturalists had not been able to. The question that drove all of this effort was deceptively simple. Could anyone actually see a living giant squid in its natural environment? For a long time, the answer was no. ROVs descended. Cameras rolled through the dark water. Hours of footage accumulated showing the strange and beautiful inhabitants of the deep. Bioluminescent jellies trailing light like torn silk. Pale fish with telescoping eyes. The slow drift of marine snow falling endlessly downward through the water column like a permanent silent blizzard of organic particles, but the giant squid, if it was there, did not appear. Part of the difficulty was the nature of the animal itself. The giant squid is not, as far as researchers can determine, a creature that spends much time near the seafloor, where ROVs could most easily maneuver and observe. It inhabits the midwater column, that vast three-dimensional space between the surface and the bottom, which is paradoxically both the largest habitat on Earth and one of the most technically difficult to observe systematically. You cannot simply rest a camera on the seafloor and wait for the squid to walk by. You have to find it in open water, in 3 dimensions, in the dark. There were tantalizing near misses. In the 1990s, fragments of fresh giant squid tissue were occasionally recovered from the water column, suggesting that living animals had been nearby. Fishing vessels working deep water long lines occasionally hauled up giant squids that had taken the bait, though these animals rarely survived the ascent intact. Each encounter added a fragment of information, a weight, a measurement, occasionally a note about coloration before the animal's chromatophores stopped functioning in death. But none of it was observation of a living animal in its natural state. And then, in 2004, everything changed. A team of Japanese researchers, Tsunemi Kubodera of the National Science Museum in Tokyo and Kyoichi Mori of the Ogasawara Whale Watching Association, deployed a camera system on a long line baited with shrimp at a depth of approximately 900 meters in the North Pacific Ocean, in waters near the Ogasawara Islands south of Japan. They had chosen this location carefully based on known sperm whale feeding grounds, operating on the reasoning that where sperm whales dove to feed, giant squid were likely to be present. They waited, and after many hours and many deployments across many days, the camera recorded something that had never been captured before in the entire history of human inquiry into this animal. A giant squid alive in its natural environment, reaching for the bait. The sequence of images, the paper was published in 2005 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, showed the animal approaching, the tentacles extending in that characteristic lunge, the moment of contact with the bait, and then a prolonged struggle as the squid attempted to free itself from the hook on which one tentacle had become caught. The animal was estimated to be approximately 8 meters in length. Its coloration, visible even in the limited light of the camera system, showed the rich reddish-brown tones that researchers had long suspected from brief encounters but never confirmed at depth. The squid eventually tore itself free, leaving behind a portion of tentacle approximately 5.5 meters long, which was itself recovered and examined, and which confirmed unambiguously that this was indeed Architeuthis dux. The scientific community responded with something not entirely unlike awe. Here finally was the evidence that all the decades of searching had been building toward: not a carcass, not a fragment, not an inference drawn from whale stomach contents, but the animal itself, moving, hunting, alive in its own world. The images were not perfect. The lighting was limited. The resolution of the technology of that era, constrained by what could be deployed at 900 meters on a long line system. But they were real, and they were extraordinary, and they changed the conversation about what it was possible to know about this animal. 3 years later, in 2007, Kubodera's team achieved something even more remarkable. Using an ROV equipped with submersible cameras and attracted by a smaller squid used as live bait, they filmed a giant squid in the water column off the Ogasawara Islands. And this time, the footage was video, not still images. moving images of a living giant squid, filmed in its natural habitat for the first time in history. The footage revealed things that still photographs could not. The way the animal moved through the water, not the frantic thrashing motion many had imagined based on its powerful musculature, but something more considered, more controlled. The arms arranged in a particular configuration during approach, the mantle pulsing with the slow rhythm of respiration. The eyes, even in video, even at depth, with that quality of attentiveness, of presence, that is so difficult to describe and so impossible to dismiss. The giant squid, it turned out, was not merely a biological machine running on instinct in the dark. It moved with something that looked unmistakably like awareness. This observation aligned with what researchers had long suspected from studying the animal's nervous system. The brain of Archaeopteryx, though small in absolute terms, is organized around enormous optic lobes, structures dedicated to processing visual information that account for a disproportionate share of the total neural tissue. The eyes themselves are the largest of any living animal, with a diameter that can reach 27 centimeters in the largest specimens, larger than a dinner plate, larger than any other eye that has ever existed on this planet in any era of its history. Those eyes did not evolve by accident, and they did not evolve to look at nothing. Research into the optics of the deep ocean has helped explain their extraordinary size. In the mesopelagic zone, the twilight zone, the dominant light source is not sunlight filtering downward, though traces of blue light do penetrate to perhaps 200 meters on clear days. The dominant light source is bioluminescence, the cold biological light produced by countless deep-sea organisms through chemical reactions in their tissues. Bacteria, dinoflagellates, jellies, fish, crustaceans, perhaps 70 to 90% of deep-sea species produce some form of bioluminescent light, and one of the primary producers of bioluminescent light in the deep ocean is the sperm whale, not the whale itself precisely, but the bioluminescent organisms that the whale disturbs as it moves through the water. A large sperm whale descending through the mesopelagic zone creates a bow wave of disturbance, a physical pressure wave that triggers the bioluminescent responses of the organisms in its path, creating a faint but detectable trail of cold blue-green light that marks the whale's passage through the dark. Researchers, most notably Sonka Johnson of Duke University, have proposed that the giant squid's enormous eyes may be specifically adapted not to see prey, which would require resolution and color discrimination, but to detect this particular kind of large, diffuse bioluminescent disturbance at great distances, to see the whale coming at the distances that matter for a squid trying to avoid a sperm whale, perhaps 120 meters, perhaps more. A smaller eye would simply not gather enough light to resolve the faint blue glow of whale-disturbed bioluminescence. But an eye 25 centimeters across, with a correspondingly enormous pupil and a retina rich in photoreceptors sensitive to the blue wavelengths that bioluminescence predominantly produces, that eye might just manage it. The giant squid's eyes, in this view, are not for hunting. They are for survival. They are the squid's best defense against the one predator large enough and fast enough to threaten it in its own domain. This interpretation remains a hypothesis, not an established certainty. Science is careful about such things, as it should be, but it has a beautiful internal logic, a rightness to it that makes it feel like the kind of answer the question deserves. The world that shaped those eyes is a world of extreme darkness, punctuated by brief, unpredictable flashes of cold light. A world where seeing something coming in time to escape may be the difference between continuing to exist and not. And so the eyes grew and grew until they reached a size that no other animal has matched. Beyond predator avoidance, researchers have pieced together other aspects of the giant squid's life from the accumulated evidence of decades of study. Reproduction, for instance, presents a set of fascinating questions that have only been partially answered. Female giant squids are substantially larger than males, sometimes significantly so, which places Archaetuthis among the many cephalopod species that exhibit pronounced sexual size dimorphism. The largest confirmed specimens have all been females. The reasons for this are not fully understood, but it may relate to the energetic demands of producing eggs. Female giant squids are believed to produce enormous egg masses, gelatinous structures containing potentially millions of tiny eggs suspended in a mucus matrix. No giant squid egg mass has ever been directly observed in the wild. What is known comes partly from the examination of female reproductive tracts in stranded specimens, and partly from comparison with closely related species that have been more amenable to observation. The eggs, when they hatch, release larvae so small and so different in appearance from the adult form that for many years researchers were uncertain how to classify them. The paralarvae of giant squid drift near the surface of the ocean, far above the depths their parents inhabit, feeding on small prey and growing with a speed that cephalopods in general are known for. Growth rates in giant squid are believed to be extraordinary by the standards of animals of their size. Chemical analysis of the statoliths, small calcium carbonate structures in the squid's head that function somewhat like the growth rings of a tree, recording age in layers, suggests that giant squids may reach their full adult size in as little as 1 to 3 years. 1 to 3 years. Pause on that for a moment. An animal that may reach 10 meters in length, that may weigh 270 kilograms or more, that has the largest eyes in the animal kingdom and arms lined with serrated sucker rings and a nervous system of considerable complexity. And it achieves all of this in perhaps 2 or 3 years of living. The metabolic demands of such growth are almost incomprehensible. The giant squid must eat and eat and eat fish, other squid, whatever the dark water provides, converting prey into body mass at a rate that makes warm-blooded animals look almost leisurely by comparison. And then, having grown, having presumably found a mate in the vast dark, through mechanisms that are still not fully understood, perhaps through bioluminescent signaling, perhaps through chemical cues dissolved in the cold water, the giant squid reproduces and then, it seems, dies. Most cephalopods are semiparous. They reproduce once and then their bodies begin to fail, the investment of biological energy in reproduction apparently consuming whatever reserves might have sustained further life. Giant squids, based on the statolith evidence, appear to follow this same pattern. They live fast, in the oceanic sense of the phrase. They grow with extraordinary speed. They reproduce with what energy remains, and then they are gone, their bodies sinking slowly through the water column after death, become food for the scavengers and decomposers of the deep, the hagfish, the crustaceans, the bacteria that consume organic matter at every depth. Nothing is wasted in the ocean. Everything cycles back. And yet, even knowing this, knowing that each individual giant squid exists only briefly in the long dark before returning to it, there is something that does not feel brief about them, something that feels paradoxically enduring. Perhaps it is the sheer antiquity of their lineage, the hundreds of millions of years that cephalopods have inhabited the oceans of this planet. Perhaps it is the way they have persisted, unchanged in their essential form, through extinction events that remade entire ecosystems. Or perhaps it is simply the way the ocean holds its mysteries so patiently, returning them to us only in fragments, only when it chooses, as if to remind us that some things do not belong to the world of full knowing, and that thought, quiet as it is, carries its own kind of weight. There is a particular kind of knowledge that lives not in facts, but in the feeling that surrounds them. The giant squid has given us both the measurable, the catalogued, the anatomically precise, and also something less tangible, but no less real, a sense of scale, of depth, of the staggering complexity that the ocean contains in its quiet, lightless interior. To know that this animal exists is to know something important about the nature of existence itself. Consider what it means for a creature to be so perfectly suited to a world so hostile to human understanding. Every adaptation of the giant squid, the jet propulsion, the serrated suckers, the chromatophore-rich skin that can shift color and pattern with extraordinary speed, the enormous eyes, the rapid growth, the brief and concentrated life, is an answer to a specific question that the deep ocean has been asking for millions of years. And the giant squid has answered every one of them quietly, in the dark, without any need for observation or acknowledgement. It did not need us to know about it in order to be extraordinary. There is something clarifying about that thought, something that gently repositions the human perspective within the larger order of things. We tend, perhaps naturally, to place our awareness at the center of what matters, to feel that a thing fully exists only when it has been seen, named, understood. But the giant squid was descending through cold black water, seizing fish with its serrated arms, regarding the bioluminescent trails of sperm whales with those plate-sized eyes. All of this for millions of years, entirely independent of whether any human mind was aware of it. The ocean is full of such independence. The chromatophores of the giant squid deserve a moment of genuine contemplation. These are pigment-containing cells distributed across the skin, each one a tiny elastic sac filled with color. Reds, browns, oranges, surrounded by a ring of muscle fibers that can contract to spread the pigment out or relax to concentrate it into a tight point. They can be controlled with extraordinary speed, shifting the animal's apparent color and pattern in fractions of a second. In the deep dark, where no sunlight reaches, one might reasonably ask what the point of this is. Color, after all, seems irrelevant in the absence of light, but bioluminescence changes everything. In a world where light is produced biologically, in flashes and pulses and steady glows, the ability to modulate one's own reflective and absorptive properties still carries meaning, and there is evidence that giant squids, like many cephalopods, may use skin pattern changes for communication. Signals directed at potential mates, at rivals, perhaps at prey. A language written in light and skin, in the deep dark, in a grammar no human has yet learned to read. The intelligence of cephalopods as a group has become a subject of serious scientific fascination in recent decades. Octopuses have received the most public attention. Their tool use, their problem solving, their apparent playfulness in captive settings has made them unlikely celebrities of popular science. But squid, including the giant squid's smaller and more studied relatives, have demonstrated forms of learning and behavioral flexibility that suggest the cephalopod nervous system is capable of more than simple reflexive response. The giant squid's brain, organized so differently from a vertebrate brain, lobed around that central esophagus, with those enormous optic lobes dominating the architecture, processes information in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. It has no cerebral cortex, nothing resembling the structures we associate with higher cognition in mammals, and yet it navigates a three-dimensional environment of extraordinary complexity, coordinates 8 arms and 2 tentacles with precise independent control, hunts prey that is itself fast and evasive, and apparently avoids predators that outweigh it by factors of 10 or 20. Whatever intelligence means in the deep ocean, the giant squid has enough of it. There is also the matter of what the giant squid means within its ecosystem, not just as a predator and as prey, but as a participant in the vast cycling of energy and matter that makes the deep ocean function. The giant squid occupies a position in the food web that ecologists call a mesopredator, a predator of significant size and appetite that is itself preyed upon by larger predators. In this position, it acts as a kind of relay, transferring energy from the mid-level prey it consumes upward to the sperm whales that hunt it. But there is another dimension to this energy transfer that is less immediately obvious. When a giant squid dies and sinks, when its body begins its slow descent through the water column toward the seafloor, it carries with it all the carbon it has accumulated during its brief life. Carbon drawn originally from the surface ocean, from photosynthesis, from the microscopic plant-like organisms that capture sunlight and build their bodies from dissolved carbon dioxide. That carbon travels up the food chain into the squid's massive body, and then, when the squid dies, down through the water column to the deep. The ocean's biological pump, one of the most important carbon sequestration mechanisms on the planet, and the giant squid is a participant in it, a carrier of carbon from the surface world to the permanent dark of the abyss. To be a giant squid is, in this sense, to be part of something planetary, to be woven into the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ocean simultaneously, in a way that connects the deepest dark to the sunlit surface in one long, slow biological thread. That thread has been unbroken for a very long time. The lineage that eventually produced Archaeoteuthis dux stretches back through time in ways that dwarf the entire history of vertebrate life on land. Cephalopods first appear in the fossil record approximately 500 million years ago, in the late Cambrian period, when the first complex animal ecosystems were assembling themselves in the shallow seas of a planet that looked almost nothing like the one we know. They have survived every mass extinction since, the end Ordovician extinction, the devastating end-Permian event that eliminated perhaps 96% of all marine species, the end Cretaceous impact that ended the age of the non-avian dinosaurs. Through all of it, the cephalopods endured, adapted, diversified, and kept descending into the dark. There is a profound patience in that survival, not a patience that is felt or chosen, but a patience that is simply the result of enduring of continuing to exist through changes so vast and so violent that entire branches of the tree of life were pruned away entirely. The giant squid carries that history in its body without knowing it, the way the deep ocean carries the memory of every storm that has ever passed over its surface, invisibly, completely, in ways that cannot be directly seen but can be felt in the slow movement of currents that were set in motion centuries ago. And so we arrive gently at the edge of what can be said, not because the story has run out. The story of the giant squid has no end that we have reached yet, no final chapter, no resolution that ties all the mysteries into a neat account. There are still questions that science has not answered, still depths that cameras have not fully illuminated, still the possibility of animals larger than any ever measured moving through water so deep and cold and dark that we may not find them for another generation or 2 or 10. But there is a point in every act of deep attention where continuing to add words begins to take something away, where the accumulation of more detail starts to crowd out the quality of wondering that makes the detail meaningful in the first place. This is that point. The deep ocean is still there. Right now, as these words settle into the quiet, somewhere below the surface of the North Pacific, or the South Atlantic, or the cold circumpolar seas, at a depth where the pressure exceeds 200 atmospheres and the temperature is barely above freezing, somewhere in that immensity, a giant squid is moving. Perhaps it is hunting, drifting slowly through the water column with its fins undulating in that quiet, considered way, its arms arranged loosely around its body, its enormous eyes open and patient in the dark, alert to the faint chemical signals that mean prey is near, or to the distant blue shimmer that might mean a sperm whale is descending from above. Perhaps it is simply existing, doing whatever it is that a giant squid does in the hours between hunting and being hunted, which is to say, living in that place the way only it can live there, with a completeness and a belonging that no visitor could replicate. It does not know it is being thought about. It has no awareness of the centuries of myth and wonder and careful science that have accumulated around its existence like sediment settling at the bottom of a very deep sea. It simply moves and breathes through its gills and feels the pressure of the water on every surface of its body, that constant, enormous embrace of the deep ocean that has been the defining condition of its kind for longer than the word ancient can quite contain. And in that movement, in that uncomplicated being, there is something that the mind can follow downward like a slow exhale, like the gradual dimming of the last blue light as the surface recedes above and the dark rises to meet you from below. Everything here is old and cold and endlessly, quietly deep. The giant squid moves on through the dark, and the ocean holds it, as it always has, completely, without comment, without condition, in the immense and patient dark. There is a kind of quiet that settles over certain rooms, a stillness that feels older than the walls themselves. And tonight I find myself standing in one such room, a grand chamber where ideas have lived and breathed for centuries, where the shape of nations has been drawn and redrawn in words and principles. The light here is amber, filtered through tall windows that have witnessed the passage of countless deliberations, and in this gentle glow I can see the outlines of wooden benches arranged in careful rows, each one worn smooth by the weight of representatives who have sat and spoken and shaped the course of their countries. This is a place where governance takes form, where the abstract notion of how people might organize themselves into nations becomes something tangible, something we can touch and examine. And as I move through this space, I feel the presence of all the different ways human beings have tried to answer one essential question: how shall we live together under shared rules? The air carries a scent of old paper and polished wood, and there is something deeply calming in knowing that this question has been asked in so many languages, in so many capitals, in chambers that look like this one, and chambers that look nothing like it at all, some ornate and gilded, others spare and modern, but all of them holding the same fundamental purpose. I let my gaze drift across the rows of seats, and I begin to see them not as empty chairs, but as vessels holding different traditions, different philosophies of power and representation, because comparative government is really the study of all these vessels, the examination of how various societies have designed their political containers, some presidential, some parliamentary, some federal, some unitary, each one reflecting particular histories and particular dreams. In one corner of the chamber there is a coat of arms carved into dark oak, and I move closer to trace the symbols with my eyes, the way each element represents some value or achievement the nation holds dear. And it occurs to me that every system of government is like this, a kind of heraldry, a set of symbols and structures that declare what a people believe about authority and liberty, and the proper relationship between the individual and the state. The windows are growing dimmer now, and the amber light is deepening into something closer to gold. And in this transitional hour between day and evening, I feel myself settling into the rhythm of contemplation, the gentle pace of someone who has all the time needed to understand something complex and beautiful. I think about the word comparative itself, the way it implies setting things side by side, not to judge which is superior, but simply to see more clearly what each one is. And there is something inherently peaceful in this act of comparison, this willingness to observe without rushing to conclusion, to notice the particular genius in a Westminster system and the particular strength in a presidential republic, to see how a federal structure solves certain problems while creating others. The room seems to expand as I consider this, as if the walls themselves are making space for all the world's parliaments and congresses and assemblies, all the councils and chambers where human beings gather to make collective decisions. And I can almost hear the echo of debates conducted in Mandarin and English and French and Arabic and Spanish, each language carrying its own way of conceiving political life. Near the center of the chamber there is a lectern, simple and unadorned, and I imagine all the speeches that have been delivered from such places, the careful arguments about constitutions and rights, the passionate defenses of particular visions for how power should be distributed, and beneath all that passion there is always structure, always the invisible architecture that determines who can speak and when, and with what authority. This architecture is what comparative government reveals, the hidden frameworks that make some nations run smoothly while others stumble, the way institutions can channel ambition and conflict into productive dialogue or let them spill over into dysfunction. And understanding these frameworks requires patience, requires the kind of slow observation I am practicing now, letting each detail emerge in its own time. The light has shifted again, softer now, and the golden hour is giving way to the blue hour. That liminal time when the world feels suspended between states, and this feels right somehow, because the study of government is always about these in-between spaces, the way power flows between branches, the negotiation between central authority and local autonomy, the balance between majority rule and minority rights. I can feel my breathing slow to match the pace of this chamber, the deep calm of a place built for deliberation rather than haste. And I know that in the words to come, I will travel through time and across continents, examining the many forms that democratic governance and authoritarian rule have taken, tracing the evolution of constitutions and the rise and fall of different models. But for now, I simply stand here, present in this quiet room, ready to begin the journey through the landscape of comparative government. The story begins long before this chamber existed, long before the word government carried its modern meaning, and to understand how human beings came to organize themselves into different political systems, we must travel back to a time when the very idea of comparing such systems would have seemed strange, because for most of human history people knew only one way, the way of their own tribe or city or kingdom. But there were places scattered across the ancient world where something new began to stir, where people started to ask not just who should rule, but how rule itself should be structured. And one of those places was a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean, where rocky hillsides overlooked a sapphire sea. Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era, a city-state small enough that you could walk across it in an afternoon, and yet within its boundaries something unprecedented was taking shape. The citizens were experimenting with a form of governance they called democratia, rule by the demos, the people themselves. I can almost see them gathering in the agora, the marketplace that served as the heart of civic life, merchants and farmers and craftsmen setting aside their work to debate the issues of the day. And this was not representation as we know it now. This was direct participation, citizens voting with their own hands on matters of war and peace and law. But even as Athens developed this radical experiment, other Greek cities were trying different approaches. Sparta, with its dual kingship and rigid military hierarchy. Corinth, with its oligarchy of wealthy families. And the Greeks themselves began to notice these differences, began to compare and contrast, to ask which a system produced the most stability or the greatest glory. Aristotle walked through streets not unlike these, observing, cataloging, trying to understand the varieties of political organization, and he collected the constitutions of 158 city-states. Studying each one as a naturalist might study different species of birds, noting their characteristics and their tendencies, their strengths and vulnerabilities. He saw that some states were ruled by one person, others by a few, still others by the many, and he noticed that each form could manifest in a good version or a corrupted version. Monarchy could become tyranny, aristocracy could decay into oligarchy, and even democracy, rule by the people, could degenerate into mob rule if not carefully structured. This was perhaps the first true work of comparative government, this patient observation that different structures produce different outcomes, and Aristotle's insight that institutions matter, that the rules governing how decisions are made shape the character of a nation, would echo through the centuries that followed. Meanwhile, far to the east, in the river valleys of China, a different kind of political thinking was emerging. Confucius, walking the roads between feudal states during the spring and autumn period, observing the chaos of competing kingdoms and developing a philosophy of governance based not on the participation of citizens, but on the cultivation of virtue in rulers. The Chinese tradition emphasized harmony and hierarchy, the idea that society functions best when each person understands their role and fulfills it with excellence. And this produced systems of government radically different from those taking shape in Greece. Centralized bureaucracies staffed by scholars selected through competitive examinations, a meritocracy of learning rather than a democracy of participation. And these two traditions, the Greek and the Chinese, would influence vast regions and countless generations, creating distinct approaches to the fundamental questions of political life, approaches that even now shape how different nations conceive of authority and citizenship and the proper role of government. But there were other tributaries feeding into this great river of political thought. Rome rising from a collection of villages on 7 hills to become a republic, then an empire, and in that transformation offering lessons about how institutions can evolve, how a system designed for a small city-state strains and ultimately breaks under the weight of vast territories and diverse populations. The Roman Republic gave us the Senate, a body of elders who provided continuity and wisdom, and the popular assemblies where citizens voted on laws and elected magistrates, and the elaborate system of checks whereby tribunes could veto actions harmful to the common people, and consuls served in pairs so that neither could accumulate too much power. I imagine standing in the Forum Romanum as twilight descends, watching the shadows lengthen across marble columns, and feeling the presence of all those careful institutional arrangements. The Romans were brilliant engineers, not just of aqueducts and roads, but of political structures. They understood that power needed to be divided and balanced. That ambition could be made to counteract ambition, but they also discovered the limits of such arrangements, learned the hard way that institutions are only as strong as the commitment of those who operate them. And when generals with loyal armies found they could bypass the Senate, when demagogues discovered they could appeal directly to the mob, when the forms were preserved but the substance had drained away, the Republic gave way to emperors and the long, slow slide into imperial rule. These ancient experiments, Greek and Roman and Chinese, laid the groundwork for all that would come after. They established the vocabulary we still use: democracy and oligarchy, republic and empire, monarchy and tyranny. And they demonstrated that governance is not natural or inevitable, but constructed, something human beings design and redesign in response to circumstances and ideals. For many centuries after Rome's fall, Europe fragmented into a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities, feudal arrangements where power was personal rather than institutional, where the relationship between lord and vassal mattered more than abstract constitutions. And during these centuries, the art of comparing governments largely slept, waiting for new circumstances to awaken it. But even in this feudal age, there were glimmers. The development of Parliament in England, beginning as an assembly the king convened when he needed to raise taxes, gradually asserting its own prerogatives, establishing the principle that the monarch could not simply impose his will, but needed the consent of at least some portion of the governed, And there were the Italian city-states of the Renaissance, Florence and Venice and Genoa, experimenting with republican forms, creating elaborate systems of councils and committees, developing techniques for preventing any one family or faction from dominating, rotating offices, using sortition, drawing lots to select officials so that chance rather than ambition determined who would serve. Venice particularly fascinated observers. This republic that had endured for centuries, longer than most kingdoms, with its great council and its senate, and its doge elected for life, but constrained by law and custom. Visitors came from across Europe to study the Venetian system, to understand how it maintained stability, while other states convulsed with civil war and revolution, and slowly, gradually, the idea of comparative government began to revive. The notion that one might study different political systems not to prove the superiority of one's own, but to learn, to borrow useful innovations, to understand the relationship between institutional design and political outcomes. Machiavelli in Florence, writing his discourses on Livy, comparing the Roman Republic to the Italian states of his own time, asking what made republics strong or weak, what allowed them to expand or caused them to decay, and his analysis was unsentimental, focused on power and incentives rather than ideals, but it was comparative. It looked at evidence from different times and places. Then came the great upheavals of the 17th century, the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, the beheading of a king and the establishment of constitutional monarchy, and suddenly political arrangements that had seemed fixed and eternal were revealed to be contingent, subject to challenge and change. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, writing in the aftermath of these upheavals, trying to understand the foundations of political authority, why people submit to government at all, and what limits, if any, constrain governmental power. And though they reached different conclusions, both engaged in a kind of thought experiment that was implicitly comparative, imagining different possible arrangements and reasoning about their consequences. Locke particularly emphasized the idea of government as a contract, a mutual agreement between rulers and ruled, and the notion that governments could be dissolved if they violated the terms of this contract, if they became tyrannical, and these ideas would travel across the Atlantic, would shape the thinking of colonists who found themselves in a new world, trying to establish governance for communities far from the centers of European power. But before we cross that ocean, before we arrive at the great wave of constitution making that would sweep the late 18th century, we must pause here in this earlier moment. This time when the systematic study of comparative government was just beginning to crystallize, when observers were starting to collect examples, to classify types, to reason about causes and effects. Montesquieu, in his chateau in France, reading voraciously about governments ancient and modern, traveling to England to observe Parliament in action, and then writing his Spirit of the Laws, a massive comparative analysis that examined how climate and geography and religion and commerce all influence the character of political systems, how different forms of government suited different circumstances. He gave us the theory of separation of powers, the idea that liberty is best preserved when legislative and executive and judicial functions are divided among different bodies, each checking the others, and this insight, born from comparing the English system to the French absolutism of his own country, would become perhaps the single most influential idea in the design of modern governments. I can feel the weight of all these centuries, all these thinkers and experiments and hard-won lessons, and the room around me seems to hold them all, the accumulated wisdom of human beings trying to solve the puzzle of how to live together under law, how to create order without tyranny, how to permit liberty without descending into chaos. The light has dimmed further now, the blue hour deepening toward night, and in this gathering darkness I sense we are approaching a threshold, approaching the moment when comparative government would become not just an intellectual exercise, but a practical necessity, when new nations would arise and their founders would deliberately study the examples of history, would consciously borrow and adapt and innovate, creating systems designed from the ground up with all the lessons of the past in mind. But that threshold would not be crossed all at once. It required crisis, required the kind of rupture that forces people to reimagine everything they thought they knew about governance. And that rupture came in the late 18th century, when 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America declared their independence from the British Crown. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 were not radicals by temperament. Many were lawyers and merchants, planters and scholars, but they found themselves in a radical situation, breaking away from what they had known, and they understood that independence meant more than separation. It meant having to construct something new. At first they tried a loose confederation, a league of sovereign states bound together only for common defense and trade, but this arrangement proved too weak, unable to raise revenue or enforce its decisions, and so they gathered again in that same city of Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to try once more. The room where they met was kept shuttered despite the heat, windows closed so that their deliberations would remain secret, and in that stifling chamber they debated through the long months of summer, arguing about representation and sovereignty, about how to balance the interests of large states and small, how to prevent the concentration of power while still creating a government strong enough to function. And here is where comparative government became practical rather than merely theoretical, because these men had studied, had read their Montesquieu and their Locke, had examined the history of Greece and Rome, had observed the workings of Parliament, and they consciously drew on all these examples, borrowing some elements, rejecting others, trying to design a system that would avoid the failures they had identified in past experiments. They created a federal system, dividing power between national and state governments, something the ancient world had never quite achieved, and they separated powers at the national level, giving legislative authority to Congress, executive power to a president, judicial responsibility to a Supreme Court, each branch with its own source of legitimacy and its own means of checking the others. The legislative branch itself was split, a House of Representatives apportioned by population, reflecting the democratic principle, and a Senate with equal representation for each state, preserving the federal principle, and laws would have to pass both chambers, would have to satisfy both majority will and federal balance. This was synthesis. This was comparative government in action, taking the bicameral structure from England, but adapting it to new purposes, embracing separation of powers, but implementing it more completely than the British had, creating an elected executive but limiting his term and constraining his powers, learning from Rome's dictators and England's kings what to avoid. And when the Constitution was finished and sent out for ratification, the debates that followed were themselves exercises in comparative analysis. The Federalist Papers comparing the proposed system to historical confederacies, to the republics of antiquity, arguing point by point why this particular design would succeed where others had failed. But even as this new system was being born, even as the United States was demonstrating that a large republic could be deliberately constructed according to rational principles, another revolution was convulsing France, and this revolution would follow a very different path. The French began with high ideals, with declarations of the rights of man and citizen, with the dream of replacing absolute monarchy with constitutional government, but they had no tradition of representative institutions to build upon, no long history of parliamentary development like England's. And the revolution spiraled through constitutions, each one replaced by another, each experiment more radical than the last. First a constitutional monarchy, then a republic, then the terror, then the Directory, and finally Napoleon, crowning himself emperor and spreading his legal code across Europe at the point of a sword. And the pattern seemed to confirm the fears of those who doubted whether revolutionary change could ever produce stable government. Yet Napoleon's conquests had an unintended effect. They disrupted the old order across the continent, planted the seeds of constitutional government in places that had known only absolute rule, and when he finally fell, when the monarchs were restored, they could not simply resurrect the past. The ideas had spread too far. The 19th century became an age of constitutions, of nations writing down the rules that would govern them, and each new constitution reflected choices, decisions about presidential versus parliamentary systems, about federalism versus unitary states, about how much power to vest in monarchs versus elected assemblies. Britain never wrote a single constitutional document, evolved instead through precedent and statute, gradually extending the franchise, slowly shifting power from crown to cabinet to commons, and this evolutionary approach became one model, the idea that institutions could adapt organically over time. But others preferred the American approach, a written constitution as a founding document, a clear statement of first principles, and throughout Latin America, as colonies gained independence from Spain and Portugal, they looked to the United States Constitution as a template, adopting federal systems and separated powers and presidential executives. Yet these transplants often struggled. The same institutions that worked in North America seemed to produce instability in South America, alternating between chaos and dictatorship, and observers began to realize that institutional design alone was not enough, that constitutions had to fit with culture and history and social structure, that you could not simply copy a system from one context and expect it to flourish in another. This was a sobering lesson, a recognition that comparative government was more complex than simply identifying the best system and replicating it. Each nation had to find arrangements suited to its particular circumstances, its level of economic development, its ethnic and religious composition, its historical experience with authority and liberty. Germany in the mid-19th century offered another variation. Bismarck, forging unity through blood and iron, creating an empire with a constitution that gave voting rights and a parliament, but preserved enormous power for the Kaiser and his appointed chancellor, a hybrid system that satisfied neither liberals nor conservatives entirely, but held together a diverse collection of kingdoms and principalities. And Japan, opening to the world after centuries of isolation, sent delegations to study European governments, and they chose the Prussian model, a constitutional monarchy with a strong executive, an arrangement that seemed to offer modernization without democracy, development without the disorder they associated with parliamentary systems. Each of these choices reflected particular fears and aspirations, particular judgments about what worked and what didn't. And the act of choosing required comparison, required looking at the experience of other nations and reasoning about what might succeed in one's own circumstances. The late 19th century saw the rise of what we might call scientific comparative government, scholars systematically collecting constitutions, classifying governmental forms, trying to identify patterns and principles. Woodrow Wilson, before he became president, writing Congressional Government, comparing the American system unfavorably to the British parliamentary model, arguing that separation of powers produced deadlock and irresponsibility. And there was Lord Bryce traveling through America, writing his massive study of the American Commonwealth, examining how federalism actually functioned, how political parties organized themselves, how state governments differed from one another, bringing the eye of a comparative observer to a system that Americans themselves often took for granted. The British Empire at its height became a laboratory of governmental forms, colonies and dominions trying different arrangements, some with appointed governors, others with elected assemblies, some evolving towards self-government, while others remained under direct rule, and each variation offered lessons about the relationship between metropolitan power and colonial autonomy. Canada developed a federal system necessary to accommodate French and English populations, but chose parliamentary government rather than presidential, creating a hybrid that combined British institutions with federal structure, and Australia and New Zealand followed similar paths. Westminster systems adapted to frontier conditions and federal necessities. India, under British rule, saw the gradual introduction of representative institutions, legislative councils with some elected members, systems that gave Indians experience in parliamentary procedures while keeping ultimate power in British hands. And these experiments would shape the choices made after independence, when India would create the world's largest democracy, a parliamentary system for a subcontinent of extraordinary diversity. The early 20th century brought new questions, new challenges to the models that had seemed settled. The Russian Revolution of 1917 offered a radically different vision, a system based not on constitutional democracy, but on the dictatorship of the proletariat, a one-party state that claimed to represent the workers and peasants, that rejected separation of powers and checks and balances as bourgeois illusions. This Soviet model would spread, would be adopted or imposed across vast territories, and for decades the world would be divided between competing visions of governance, between liberal democracies with their emphasis on individual rights and competitive elections, and communist states with their emphasis on collective ownership and centralized planning. And between these poles, many variations, social democracies in Scandinavia, combining market economies with extensive welfare states and strong parliamentary systems, developmental states in East Asia, where governments actively guided economic growth while limiting political competition, populist movements in Latin America experimenting with different ways of organizing popular participation and controlling elite power. The interwar period saw democracy falter in many places, the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, authoritarian governments across much of Eastern and Southern Europe, and observers worried that perhaps democracy was a luxury that only wealthy, stable societies could afford, that nations facing economic crisis or external threats would inevitably turn to strongmen. But the Second World War and its aftermath seemed to settle the question differently. The defeat of fascism, the discrediting of racial authoritarianism, and a new wave of constitution-making as colonies gained independence and defeated nations were rebuilt, Germany and Japan remaking themselves as democracies under occupation, India and dozens of African nations choosing democratic constitutions as they achieved sovereignty. Yet the Cold War meant that every constitutional choice had geopolitical implications. Every debate about governmental systems was shadowed by the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, between capitalism and communism, between liberal democracy and socialist planning. And nations found themselves pressured to choose sides, to adopt models associated with one bloc or the other. The newly independent nations faced particular challenges: artificial borders drawn by colonial powers, ethnic and religious diversity that made national unity fragile, economies dependent on exporting raw materials, and they experimented with various approaches, some copying Westminster models, others trying presidential systems, still others attempting to forge indigenous alternatives that drew on traditional forms of leadership and consensus. Tanzania under Julius Nyerere developed Ujamaa, African socialism based on village communities, one-party democracy that claimed to achieve unity without oppression, and many other African leaders followed similar paths, arguing that multi-party competition was a Western import, unsuited to African conditions, that development required unity and discipline rather than the luxury of opposition. But these experiments often produced disappointment, one-party states that became vehicles for corruption and personal rule, economies that stagnated under central planning, and gradually the consensus shifted. The idea grew that democracy and development were not opposed but complementary, that accountability and competition could strengthen rather than weaken nations. I can feel the weight of all these experiments, all these different paths taken, some leading to stability and prosperity, others to conflict and poverty, and the challenge of understanding why some systems flourish in some contexts while failing in others, why institutions that work brilliantly in one setting produce disaster in another. The room around me seems filled with ghostly parliaments, with chambers and assemblies from every continent, each one representing particular choices about how to organize collective life. And in the gathering darkness, I sense that we are approaching the moment when all these accumulated experiences, all these varied experiments would converge into new questions, new challenges that the old framework struggled to address. The turning point came in the final decades of the 20th century, a cascade of changes that transformed the landscape of comparative government, and the most dramatic shift began in Southern Europe in the 1970s, When Portugal and Spain and Greece emerged from decades of authoritarian rule, these transitions were called the third wave of democratization. The first wave having been the age of revolutions in the late 18th and 19th centuries, the second wave following the Allied victories in the world wars, and now this third wave washing across regions that many had written off as culturally unsuited to democracy. Portugal moved first. A revolution of carnations in 1974, soldiers placing flowers in their rifle barrels as they overthrew a dictatorship that had lasted nearly half a century, and the transition was messy, involved radical movements and counter-movements, but ultimately produced a stable parliamentary democracy, a constitution that guaranteed rights and created institutions for peaceful competition. Spain followed, navigating the delicate passage from Franco's death to constitutional monarchy. King Juan Carlos playing a crucial role, using his authority to support democratic reform rather than preserve authoritarian power, and the crafting of regional autonomy arrangements that gave Catalonia and the Basque Country significant self-government while preserving national unity. These Southern European transitions became templates, demonstrated that democracy could be built through negotiation and compromise, that authoritarian elites could be persuaded to accept new rules if given sufficient guarantees, and scholars studying these cases developed theories about how transitions happen, about the importance of pacts between reformers and moderates, about sequencing of elections and constitutional reforms. Then came Latin America, where military dictatorships that had seemed permanent began to crumble. Argentina after the Falklands War, Brazil through a gradual opening, Chile after Pinochet accepted a referendum on his rule and lost, and each transition involved particular bargains, particular institutional choices about how to deal with the past, whether to prosecute military officers for human rights abuses or grant amnesties in the name of reconciliation. And these transitions revealed new questions for comparative government, not just how to design stable democratic institutions, but how to build them in societies traumatized by repression, how to establish civilian control over militaries that had ruled directly, how to create trust in democratic procedures among populations that had learned to expect violence and arbitrary power. The 1980s brought changes in Asia as well. South Korea moving toward democracy after decades of authoritarian development. Taiwan beginning its slow transition from one-party rule, the Philippines rising up against Marcos, and each of these cases involved different dynamics, different configurations of social forces and institutional legacies. South Korea's democratization was driven partly by a growing middle class, educated citizens demanding political rights to match their economic achievements, and this seemed to confirm theories about modernization, about economic development, creating pressures for political opening, but other cases complicated the picture. Singapore and China achieving rapid growth while maintaining authoritarian control, suggesting that the relationship between development and democracy was contingent rather than automatic. Then came 1989, the year the world shifted on its axis, the Berlin Wall falling, communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsing in the space of months, peaceful revolutions in Prague and Budapest and Warsaw, violent overthrow in Romania, and suddenly dozens of nations faced the challenge of building democratic institutions from scratch. These post-communist transitions were different from earlier waves because they involved not just political change but wholesale economic transformation, moving from command economies to markets while simultaneously building democratic institutions. And the dual transition proved extraordinarily difficult, required creating property rights and regulatory frameworks and tax systems and central banks, all while writing constitutions and holding elections and establishing rule of law. Some nations managed the transition relatively smoothly, Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic moving towards stable parliamentary democracies and market economies, eventually joining the European Union, adopting its standards and benefiting from its support. But others struggled, Russia lurching through economic chaos and political conflict, oligarchs capturing state resources, democratic forms persisting but hollowed out by corruption and concentrated power, and Central Asia and the Caucasus, where communist collapse led not to democracy but to new forms of authoritarianism, leaders from the old party apparatus reinventing themselves as presidents for life, creating hybrid regimes that held elections but ensured the outcomes, that had constitutions but ignored them when convenient. Comparative government as a field had to grapple with these hybrid regimes, systems that combined elements of democracy and authoritarianism in complex ways, competitive authoritarian regimes where opposition existed but faced systematic disadvantages, electoral autocracies that used the forms of democracy to legitimize fundamentally undemocratic rule. Scholars developed new typologies, tried to map the space between clear democracy and clear dictatorship, created measures of democracy that could capture gradations, and debates raged about whether these hybrid systems represented transitions toward full democracy or stable equilibria, or even disguised paths toward full authoritarianism. The late 20th century also saw important innovations in democratic design, new solutions to old problems. New Zealand, abandoning its Westminster first-past-the-post system for proportional representation, seeking to better represent minority views and force coalition building, and this change was studied closely by other nations considering electoral reform. South Africa faced perhaps the most daunting transition of all, emerging from apartheid with deep racial divisions and a history of systematic oppression, and the negotiated settlement produced a remarkably inclusive constitution with strong protections for minority rights, a constitutional court empowered to strike down laws, and provisions for power sharing during the initial transition period. The South African case raised profound questions about constitutional design in deeply divided societies, about whether democracy required majority rule or whether divided societies needed different arrangements, consociational systems with guaranteed representation for different groups, power-sharing executives, minority vetoes on crucial issues, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Lebanon, all experimented with various forms of power sharing, trying to prevent majority groups from dominating minorities, trying to give all communities a stake in the system. But these arrangements also created problems, sometimes leading to deadlock, sometimes entrenching ethnic divisions rather than transcending them. The European Union itself became a fascinating case study, a supranational organization that combined elements of federal and confederal systems, with some powers pooled at the European level and others retained by member states, with a directly elected parliament, but also a council representing national governments, and the question of whether this represented the future of governance or a unique historical anomaly occupied many minds. As the 21st century opened, comparative government faced new challenges. Globalization meant that national governments were increasingly constrained by international markets, and institutions could not simply choose whatever policies they preferred without considering how capital and labor and goods would flow in response. And technology was transforming the possibilities of governance. The Internet creating new forms of communication and mobilization, social media enabling both democratic activism and authoritarian surveillance. And the question arose whether the institutions designed in the 18th and 19th centuries could handle the pace of change in the 21st. The global financial crisis of 2008 shook confidence in democratic governance, as elected governments seemed unable to prevent or adequately respond to economic catastrophe, and populist movements arose in many democracies, challenging established parties and institutions, claiming that elites had rigged the system, demanding more direct forms of popular sovereignty. Some nations experimented with participatory budgeting, letting citizens directly decide how to allocate portions of public spending, with citizen assemblies, randomly selected groups deliberating on complex policy questions, with digital platforms for consultation and feedback, trying to supplement representative institutions with more direct forms of engagement, but others moved in authoritarian directions. Turkey and Hungary and Poland seeing democratic backsliding, elected leaders undermining checks and balances, capturing courts and media, restricting civil society. And this raised troubling questions about whether democracy was as secure as it had seemed, whether the third wave might be followed by a reverse wave. China's rise complicated the picture further. A one-party authoritarian state achieving remarkable economic growth and technological advancement, building infrastructure and reducing poverty, projecting power globally, and some observers wondered whether the Chinese model represented a viable alternative to liberal democracy, whether authoritarianism enhanced by technology could outperform messy democratic systems. But others pointed to the brittleness of authoritarian regimes, their inability to peacefully transfer power, their tendency to make catastrophic mistakes because they lack mechanisms for correction and accountability, and the debate over regime types took on new urgency, new stakes in a multipolar world. The study of comparative government had evolved enormously, from Aristotle's classification of constitutions to sophisticated quantitative analysis using global data sets, from philosophical speculation about ideal forms to careful empirical study of how institutions actually function, from focus on formal rules to attention to informal practices and political culture. Scholars now examined not just constitutions but political parties and electoral systems, bureaucracies and courts, federalism and decentralization, civil-military relations and mechanisms of accountability, trying to understand the complex interactions between formal institutions and informal norms, between structures and agency, between inherited constraints and present choices. And they recognized that there was no single best system, no one-size-fits-all solution, that presidential systems worked well in some contexts and poorly in others, that parliamentary systems had their own strengths and weaknesses, that federalism solved some problems while creating new ones, that every institutional choice involved trade-offs. The field had become both more humble and more sophisticated, less confident in universal prescriptions, more attentive to context and path dependence, more aware that building effective governance required not just good design but patient institution building, development of trust and norms, and habits of cooperation. I can feel the accumulated weight of all these experiences, all these transitions and experiments, all these hopes realized and disappointed, and the chamber around me seems to pulse with the knowledge that governance is never finished, that every generation must renew and adapt the institutions it inherits, must balance continuity and change, must find ways to address new challenges while preserving what works. The darkness outside is complete now, the windows showing only reflections of the dim interior, and in this enclosed space I sense that we have traced a long arc from ancient city-states to modern supranational unions, from rule by kings to government by consent, from systems that evolved organically to institutions deliberately designed, and through it all, the constant human effort to organize collective life in ways that balance order and freedom, stability and responsiveness, the interests of majorities and the rights of minorities. And yet, beneath all the institutional variations, beneath the differences between presidential and parliamentary systems, between federal and unitary states, between proportional representation and winner-take-all, there runs a deeper current, a set of questions that every system must somehow answer. The first question is about legitimacy, about why people obey, why they accept the authority of laws they did not personally consent to, why they pay taxes to governments they may have voted against, and different systems ground their legitimacy in different sources, some in divine right, some in tradition, some in the consent of the governed, some in their claim to represent historical necessity or the will of the people. But legitimacy is fragile. It must be renewed in each generation. And this is perhaps what comparative government reveals most clearly, that institutions endure only as long as enough people believe in them, only as long as they deliver outcomes that citizens find acceptable, only as long as they maintain at least minimal fairness and competence. The second question concerns representation, how the many can be governed while still having some voice in their own governance. And this question has no perfect answer, only different imperfect solutions. Elections that let citizens choose leaders but cannot capture the full complexity of public opinion. Parliaments that represent geographic districts but may not reflect other important identities. Parties that aggregate interests but also simplify and distort them. Some systems try to represent everyone proportionally, ensuring that each significant view has seats in the legislature, while others privilege geographic representation, giving voice to local communities and territorial diversity. And still others incorporate functional representation, seats for workers or farmers or religious groups, trying to ensure that particular interests are heard, but representation always involves both inclusion and exclusion, decisions about who counts as a citizen, who gets to vote, who can run for office, and these boundaries have shifted over time from male property owners to universal suffrage, from exclusion based on race or religion to formal equality, though informal barriers often persist even after formal ones fall. The third question is about power, how to create governments strong enough to function, to maintain order and provide public goods and defend against threats, while preventing them from becoming oppressive, And this tension between effectiveness and restraint runs through every constitutional design, every debate about executive authority and legislative oversight, every question about judicial review and administrative discretion. Federalism is one answer, dividing power between levels of government so that no single authority controls everything. But federalism creates coordination problems, questions about which level should handle which responsibilities, conflicts between national standards and local variation, and the balance must be constantly renegotiated as circumstances change. Separation of powers is another answer, creating multiple institutions that must cooperate to act, that can check each other's ambitions. But this too has costs, the possibility of gridlock, the difficulty of fixing responsibility when power is dispersed, the risk that stalemate will breed frustration and cynicism. And there are deeper patterns that comparative study reveals, the way institutions shape incentives, creating rules that make cooperation more or less likely, that reward moderation or extremism, that encourage leaders to build broad coalitions or mobilize narrow bases, that foster compromise or confrontation. Parliamentary systems with proportional representation tend to produce multi-party systems and coalition governments, requiring negotiation and power sharing, forcing parties to work together across ideological lines. While presidential systems with majoritarian elections often produce two-party competition, clearer accountability perhaps, but also winner-take-all politics and sharper polarization. Yet these tendencies are not deterministic. Culture and history matter too. The informal norms that fill the gaps in written rules, the habits of trust or suspicion that shape how conflicts are resolved, the reservoir of legitimacy that institutions can draw on when facing challenges, and these intangibles are harder to measure, harder to transfer from one context to another. The study of comparative government teaches humility, teaches that there are no perfect systems, only systems that work reasonably well for particular peoples in particular times, and that even the best designed institutions can fail if underlying conditions deteriorate, if inequality becomes too extreme, if social trust erodes, if external shocks overwhelm adaptive capacity. But it also teaches hope, because it shows that governance is not fixed, that nations can learn from each other, can borrow successful innovations and avoid costly mistakes, that constitutional design matters, that thoughtful institutional reform can improve outcomes, that the human project of self-government, difficult as it is, remains possible. I think of all the constitutions written and rewritten, all the experiments attempted, all the careful thought invested in trying to create systems that work, and I feel a kind of reverence for this ongoing effort, this refusal to accept that governance must be imposed from above, this insistence that ordinary people can collectively shape their own political lives. And I think of the countless individuals whose names are forgotten, but whose actions made democracy possible, the protesters who faced tanks and tear gas, the judges who ruled against powerful interests, the legislators who crafted compromises, the citizens who simply voted and paid taxes and served on juries, performing the mundane acts that keep self-government functioning. Comparative government is ultimately about choice, about recognizing that political arrangements are human creations, not natural facts, and that different choices produce different results, that we can do better by learning from experience, both our own and others, that observation and analysis and careful thought can help us build institutions worthy of the name. The chamber where I stand feels timeless now, as if it exists outside any particular moment, holding within it all the parliaments and congresses that have ever met, all the constitutions ever written, all the debates about how people should govern themselves. And in this timeless space, I sense the continuity of the human political project. The way each generation inherits institutions from the past and passes them, changed or unchanged, to the future. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson, that government is not a problem to be solved once and for all, but an ongoing practice, a set of habits and arrangements that must be maintained, adapted, renewed, that requires vigilance and participation, compromise and principle, the willingness to engage with those we disagree with, and the courage to stand firm on fundamental values. The work is never finished, the perfect constitution never written, the ideal balance never struck, because circumstances change and new challenges arise, and what worked yesterday may fail tomorrow. But this does not mean the effort is futile, only that it must continue, that each generation must take up the task anew. I can feel my thoughts beginning to settle, like sediment drifting down through clear water, and the urgency of comparison gives way to something quieter, a simple appreciation for the fact that human beings have tried so many ways, have thought so deeply, have cared so much about getting governance right. The light in the chamber has faded to almost nothing, just the faintest glow from sources I cannot identify. And in this near darkness, the physical details recede, the wooden benches and carved symbols becoming shadows, and what remains is the essential thing, the human desire to live under rule of law rather than arbitrary power, to have some voice in the decisions that affect our lives, to create order without sacrificing freedom. And I realize that every system we have examined, every constitution written, and every institution created represents an answer to this desire, imperfect perhaps, compromised by circumstances and human limitations, but genuine nonetheless, a sincere attempt to realize the possibility of self-government. The comparative study reveals not winners and losers, but a family of attempts, presidential and parliamentary, federal and unitary, majoritarian and proportional, each with virtues and vices, each suited to particular contexts. And the richness lies not in finding the one true system, but in understanding the full range of possibilities, the different ways that human communities have organized their collective lives. I let my gaze drift once more around the chamber, taking in the whole space, and I imagine it filled not with ghosts, but with potential, with all the future constitutions yet to be written, all the innovations yet to be tried, all the wisdom yet to be gained from careful observation and comparison. Because the story of comparative government does not end, it continues in every nation wrestling with how to organize itself, in every constitutional convention and reform commission, in every citizen trying to understand why their government works the way it does and how it might work better. And in this continuing story, we are all participants, not just passive observers, because governance depends on us, on our willingness to engage, to learn, to take seriously the task of collective self-rule, to study what has worked elsewhere and think carefully about what might work here. The silence in the chamber is profound now, a silence that feels full rather than empty, pregnant with all that has been and all that might be. And I stand in this silence feeling grateful, grateful for the accumulated wisdom of centuries, grateful for the courage of those who have fought for self-government, grateful for the patient work of building institutions that serve human dignity and freedom. My breathing has slowed to match the rhythm of this space, deep and even, and I notice that my mind has grown very quiet, the flood of facts and dates and names receding, leaving only the essential understanding that government is a human art, practiced differently in different places, but always aiming at the same fundamental goals: order and justice, stability and change, the welfare of the community and the rights of individuals. And as I stand here in the gathering stillness, I feel the weight lifting, the burden of all that information settling into something lighter, into simple awareness, that we have choices about how to organize our political lives, that these choices matter, and that by studying how others have chosen, by comparing systems and learning from successes and failures, we can choose more wisely. The room itself seems to be fading now, the walls becoming less distinct, the boundaries between inside and outside softening, and I am left with just the essential feeling, a sense of wonder at the human capacity for political creation, at the ingenuity and care invested in designing systems of governance, at the possibility that ordinary people can come together and craft rules for their common life. And this wonder is quiet, not excited or urgent, but peaceful. The kind of feeling that comes late at night, when thinking about something vast and important, when the details matter less than the overall pattern, when understanding deepens into something wordless. I notice that I am no longer actively thinking, no longer analyzing or comparing, just being present with this awareness, this knowledge that has settled into my bones, that governance is both universal and particular, that every human community must somehow organize itself, but that the ways of organizing are wonderfully various, each one reflecting particular histories and hopes and fears. And in this peaceful awareness, I feel the story completing itself, feel that we have traveled from ancient Athens to the present, from the first systematic comparisons to the sophisticated analysis of today. And through it all, we have seen the same human struggle, the attempt to create order without tyranny, to permit freedom without chaos, to balance competing goods that cannot all be perfectly realized. The chamber is barely visible now, more felt than seen, and even that feeling is fading, dissolving into simple restfulness, into the satisfaction of having traced a long arc, having held in mind the vast sweep of human political experience, and now letting it settle, letting it become part of the background, quiet knowledge that shapes understanding without demanding attention. And I stand in this fading space, this room that is now more idea than place, and I feel complete, feel that the journey through comparative government has reached its natural end, not because there is nothing more to say, but because what needs to be said, has been offered into the quiet, and now can rest. The last traces of the chamber dissolve, the amber light and wooden benches, the carved symbols and tall windows, all receding into darkness, and I am left in stillness, in the peace of completed thought, in the gentle awareness that hovers between waking and something else, something quieter, deeper, more restful. And in this deepening quiet, the story ends, not with conclusion, but with fading, with thoughts becoming softer, more diffuse, until there is only the faintest awareness, barely a whisper, and then, even that, gently releases. I find myself thinking about fermentation, about transformation, about how the smallest organisms we cannot see have shaped the largest currents of human history, and how a simple act, fruit falling from a tree, grain moistened by rain, honey diluted by morning dew, could unlock something that would travel with us through millennia, something that would become ceremony and commerce, medicine and myth, celebration and sorrow. There is something almost magical in the idea that sweetness, given time, given warmth, given the invisible work of yeast drifting through the air, becomes something else entirely, something that changes not just in flavor but in effect, in meaning, in the way it moves through a body, through a culture, through an empire. I imagine the first person who tasted it, perhaps by accident, perhaps after a clay jar had been left in a corner too long, or a wooden bowl of crushed grapes had sat in the sun for days. And there was that first sip, that unexpected sharpness on the tongue, that warmth spreading through the chest, that subtle shift in perception, in mood, in the weight of the world. They would not have known the chemistry, would not have understood that single-celled fungi were consuming sugars and exhaling ethanol and carbon dioxide, would not have known about Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or enzymatic processes, or the relationship between temperature and fermentation rate. But they would have known the result, would have felt it, would have recognized that something sacred had occurred. And so it began, this relationship between humans and fermented beverages, stretching back so far that we find its traces in pottery shards from the Neolithic, in residues clinging to the inner surfaces of jars that were already ancient when the first cities rose, in the careful records kept by scribes who documented rations and tributes, in the myths that placed wine in the hands of gods and beer at the foundation of creation itself. I think about how alcohol is both singular and plural, one phenomenon with countless expressions, beer and wine and mead and sake and pulque and kvass and arak and countless others, each one emerging from what was available, what grew in that particular soil, what the climate allowed, what tradition preserved, and yet all of them sharing that essential transformation, that patient waiting for invisible forces to do their work. There is something deeply human about this, about learning to guide a natural process, to create conditions where wild yeasts would settle and begin their mysterious labor, to protect the fermenting liquid from spoilage, to develop techniques that could be passed down through generations, refined, perfected, until what began as happy accident became deliberate craft. I find myself drawn to the stories, to the way alcohol appears again and again in the archaeological record, in the written histories, in the religious texts and legal codes and medical treatises, as if we cannot tell the story of human civilization without also telling the story of these transformed liquids, without acknowledging how deeply they are woven into the fabric of our social structures, our economies, our rituals of birth and death, and everything between. And perhaps that is because alcohol has always existed at intersections between nourishment and intoxication, between the everyday and the sacred, between individual experience and collective ritual, between pleasure and danger, between the wild processes of nature and the controlled practices of culture. I imagine the slow accumulation of knowledge, how each generation learned something new about the timing, the temperatures, the vessels, the ingredients, how they discovered that certain grains made better beer, that certain grapes yielded finer wine, that honey diluted just so would ferment into something golden and potent, that the white film forming on the surface was not always contamination, but sometimes a protective layer, that wooden barrels imparted their own subtle flavors, that aging could mellow harshness into complexity. This knowledge was precious, was power, was wealth, and so we find it guarded by priesthoods and guilds, regulated by laws and taxed by governments, used as currency and tribute, poured out as offerings to deities who were thought to have given the gift of fermentation to humanity, or perhaps to have created the world itself from fermented grain, as in the ancient Sumerian myths where the goddess Ninkasi presides over the brewing of beer. The evidence reaches back further than we might imagine, back to a time when humans were just beginning to settle, to plant seeds intentionally rather than simply gathering what grew wild, to store surplus grain in vessels made from clay, and in those vessels, in those stores of barley and wheat and millet, the conditions were perfect for something unexpected to occur. In the Fertile Crescent, in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, archaeologists have found residues in pottery fragments dating back 9,000 years, chemical signatures that speak of fermented beverages made from grain, from dates, from honey, evidence that the people of these ancient settlements were already familiar with the transformation, already incorporating it into their daily lives and their ceremonial practices. There is a question that scholars still debate, whether agriculture emerged because humans wanted to ensure a steady supply of grain for bread, or whether the desire for beer, for that reliable source of fermented drink, might have been equally important in motivating people to stay in one place, to tend crops, to build permanent settlements around their fields and granaries. It is a curious thought that civilization itself might owe something to fermentation, that the need to protect brewing supplies, to maintain the knowledge of how to brew, to gather for communal drinking, might have been among the threads that wove scattered groups into villages, villages into cities, cities into kingdoms. The Sumerians left us recipes, actual instructions pressed into clay tablets in cuneiform script, and among these practical texts we find hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, and the hymn is itself a brewing manual describing how to soak grain until it sprouts, how to dry the malt and crush it, how to mix it with bread and dates in large vats, how to filter the mash through woven straws to draw out the liquid, how to let it ferment in vessels cooled by the earth. Beer in ancient Mesopotamia was not what we might picture today. It was thick and nutritious, consumed through long straws to avoid the sediment and grain husks floating on the surface. It was a daily ration for workers, a payment for labor, a temple offering, a social lubricant at festivals, and it came in multiple varieties, some stronger than others, some flavored with different combinations of dates and spices and herbs. The brewing was often done by women, And in many ancient societies, this pattern holds fermentation as women's knowledge, women's craft, passed from mother to daughter alongside other essential skills. The timing and the temperatures and the signs that indicated success or spoilage. Meanwhile, in the Nile Valley, the Egyptians were developing their own rich tradition of brewing and of winemaking as well, for grapes grew abundantly in the delta and along the river's banks. And tomb paintings show us the process in vivid detail, workers treading grapes in large vats, the juice flowing into vessels, the sealed jars being stored in cool cellars or marked with the year and the vineyard and the name of the vintner. Wine in Egypt was a luxury, associated with the elite, with royal banquets and religious ceremonies, while beer remained the drink of the common people, nutritious and safer than water, which could carry disease from the river. And here we see a pattern that will repeat across cultures. Alcohol serving not just as intoxicant, but as nutrition, as hydration, as medicine. The Egyptian medical papyri mention beer and wine as vehicles for other medicines, as bases for healing compounds, and sometimes as cures in themselves, prescribed for various ailments in specific quantities and preparations, mixed with honey or herbs or ground minerals, applied externally or consumed. The dead were buried with supplies for the afterlife, and among the food and furniture and precious objects, there were always jars of beer, containers of wine, because the journey beyond required sustenance, and the pleasures of life should continue in the realm of Osiris. In China, a different path emerged. Rice became the foundation of fermented drinks, and the process was different from the brewing of barley beer, requiring the use of specific molds to break down the starches in rice into fermentable sugars, a parallel discovery of how to manipulate microorganisms, how to create the conditions for transformation. The earliest evidence of rice-based alcohol in China dates back some 9,000 years as well, to Neolithic villages in the Yellow River Valley. Chemical analysis of pottery revealing traces of a mixed fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit, suggesting that even in these early times, people were experimenting, combining ingredients, discovering what worked, what pleased the palate, what produced the desired effects. By the time of the Shang dynasty, more than 3,000 years ago, alcohol had become deeply embedded in Chinese culture, used in elaborate ritual ceremonies to honor ancestors, poured out as offerings in bronze vessels of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship, vessels that themselves became symbols of power and legitimacy, passed down through generations, buried with nobles and kings. The oracle bones, those fragments of turtle shell and ox bone used for divination, contain characters that relate to alcohol, to brewing, to ritual drinking, evidence of how central these practices were to religious and political life, how the intoxicated state was seen as a bridge between the human and spirit worlds, a way of communing with forces beyond ordinary perception. In the Indus Valley, in the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, we find less written evidence because the script remains undeciphered, but the archaeological remains suggest sophisticated brewing operations, and we know that by the Vedic period, several thousand years ago, the ancient Indians were producing soma, a ritual drink mentioned repeatedly in the Rig Veda, its exact composition now lost to time, debated by scholars, but clearly central to religious practice, consumed by priests, offered to gods, associated with inspiration and divine vision. The Greeks inherited their wine culture from earlier civilizations, from the Minoans on Crete, who were making wine before the Greek language was even written down, from the Phoenician traders who spread viticulture across the Mediterranean, and the Greeks elevated wine to an art form, a subject of a philosophy and poetry. They mixed their wine with water, considering it barbaric to drink it undiluted, and they had special vessels for the mixing, the crater, and for the serving, the kylix and the amphora. And wine was central to the symposium, that uniquely Greek institution where men gathered to drink and talk and sing and debate into the night, where philosophy was born in wine-soaked conversation, where politics was discussed and alliances formed and culture transmitted. Dionysus, the god of wine, was a complex figure associated not just with pleasure and celebration, but with ecstasy and madness, with the dissolution of normal boundaries, with transformation itself. His festivals involved theatrical performances that would evolve into Greek drama, processions and rituals that allowed for temporary inversions of social order, moments when the usual rules could be suspended. The Greeks established vineyards throughout their colonies, spreading wine culture from the Black Sea to southern Italy and Sicily, to the southern coasts of France and Spain. And as they traded, as they shared their techniques and their appreciation, wine became a marker of civilization itself, a distinction between the cultured Mediterranean peoples and the beer-drinking tribes to the north. The Romans adopted Greek wine culture and expanded it, industrialized it, creating vast vineyard estates worked by slave labor, developing new techniques for viticulture and winemaking, for storing and aging, for transporting wine across their growing empire in amphorae sealed with pitch, marked with stamps indicating origin and date and quality. Roman law regulated the wine trade carefully, protecting certain regional varieties, taxing imports and exports, and wine flowed along Roman roads and shipping routes, from the sunny hillsides of Italy and Greece and Spain to the far reaches of the empire, to Britain and Germania and North Africa, to the legions stationed on distant frontiers, to the cities that sprang up in the wake of conquest. The Romans also appreciated beer, especially in the northern provinces where grapes would not easily grow, and they encountered local brewing traditions among the Celtic and Germanic peoples, traditions that predated Roman arrival by thousands of years, for these northern cultures had their own deep relationship with fermented grain, with mead made from honey, with drinks flavored with herbs, and plants that grew in their forests. Across the ocean, in the Americas, other traditions were emerging independently. The peoples of Mesoamerica fermenting the sap of the maguey plant into pulque, a milky white beverage with its own gods and rituals, its own social regulations about who could drink it and when and how much. In South America, the making of chicha from maize, chewed and spat to begin the fermentation process, the enzymes in saliva, breaking down the starches, a communal activity, women gathering to prepare the grain, to begin the transformation that would yield the drink for festivals, for offerings, for the binding of communities through shared consumption. These traditions existed in parallel, separated by vast distances and millennia of independent development, yet converging on the same fundamental discovery that sugars could be transformed, that grains and fruits and plant saps could become something more than simple nourishment, could become vessels for altered consciousness, for social bonding, for sacred communion. The medieval period in Europe saw monasteries become the guardians of brewing and wine-making knowledge, monks and nuns perfecting techniques behind stone walls. In quiet cloisters where patience and precision were virtues, where the slow work of fermentation aligned with the rhythms of prayer and contemplation, the Benedictines and Cistercians especially became renowned for their beers and wines, each monastery developing its own recipes, its own character of brew. The monks carefully tending their vineyards on sunny slopes, their hop gardens in the valleys, their barley fields in the lowlands, understanding that the quality of the final product depended on countless small decisions made throughout the year. They kept detailed records, noting which grapes produced the finest wine, which combination of grains made the most balanced beer, how long the fermentation should proceed, how to recognize when the process was complete, when to rack the liquid off the sediment, how to clarify and stabilize what they had made. Beer was essential to monastic life, drunk at meals because water was often unsafe, brewed strong for the monks themselves and weaker for visitors and the poor who came to the monastery gates, and certain monasteries became famous for their brewing, their reputation spreading along pilgrimage routes, their techniques slowly diffusing outward into the secular world. The Trappist breweries that still operate today are the direct descendants of this tradition, maintaining methods that reach back centuries, using the profits from their brewing to support their contemplative communities, to fund charitable works, connecting the sacred and the commercial in ways that would have been familiar to their medieval predecessors. Wine production, too, was largely centered in monasteries and in the estates of nobles, the great vineyards of Burgundy and Bordeaux, of the Rhine and Moselle valleys, of Tuscany and Rioja, already establishing reputations that persist into our own time, already learning which grape varieties thrived in which soils and microclimates, which slopes caught the sun at the right angle, which riverside plots benefited from the reflected light and moderated temperatures. The process of making wine was becoming more refined, more deliberate. Vintners learning to control fermentation more precisely, discovering that different yeasts imparted different flavors, that temperature mattered, that the timing of harvest affected sugar content and acidity, that the vessels used for fermentation and aging, whether clay or wood or later glass, contributed their own subtle influences. In the cooler climates where grapes struggled, where beer was the dominant drink, brewing became a household task, women's work in most places, ale wives who brewed in their homes and sold the excess at market, marked by the ale stake, a pole thrust through a bush or wreath to signal that fresh beer was available. The ale was drunk young, within days of brewing, because without hops it spoiled quickly, and the flavor would have been quite different from modern beer, sweeter perhaps, muddier, with the taste of the grains prominent, sometimes flavored with groot, a mixture of herbs and spices that varied by region and by brewer, yarrow and wild rosemary and sweet gale and mugwort and dozens of other plants, each adding their own bitterness and aromatics and preservative qualities. The introduction of hops changed everything, slowly at first, spreading from Central Europe westward over several centuries. Hops added bitterness to balance the sweetness of the malt, but more importantly, they acted as a preservative, allowing beer to last weeks or even months without souring, making it possible to brew larger batches, to transport beer over longer distances, to develop commercial brewing operations that could serve entire towns and cities. By the late medieval period, by the time of the Renaissance, brewing was becoming industrialized, moving from the household to the commercial brewery, from small batches to large production, from the domain of women to the province of guild-controlled craftsmen, and with this shift came regulation, quality standards, taxation. The German purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, enacted in Bavaria in the early 16th century, mandated that beer could contain only water and barley and hops, later amended to include yeast once its role was understood. This was partly about quality control, partly about protecting the wheat supply for bread, partly about eliminating competing brewers who used other additives, and it became a point of pride, a standard that some brewers still observe more than 500 years later. Distillation enters the story here, the technology arriving in Europe from the Islamic world, where alchemists had developed sophisticated apparatus for separating and purifying substances, for concentrating essences, and this technology, applied to fermented beverages, produced something entirely new: spirits, liquor, concentrated alcohol that burned going down, that could be preserved almost indefinitely, that could be flavored and aged in ways that created entirely new categories of drink. The earliest distilled beverages in Europe were probably made by monks, used as medicines, aqua vitae, the water of life, prescribed for various ailments, rubbed on sore joints, taken internally for digestion, for strengthening the heart, for warding off plague, and only gradually, over centuries, did distilled spirits become beverages consumed for pleasure rather than strictly for health. Whiskey emerged in Ireland and Scotland, distilled from barley beer, rough and fiery at first, gradually refined, the Scots discovering that aging it in wooden casks mellowed the harsh edges, allowed flavors to develop and integrate, the wood itself contributing vanillas and tannins, the slow oxidation creating complexity. In France, the distillation of wine produced brandy, and in the region of Cognac, on the Charente River, a particular style emerged: double distillation in copper pot stills, aging in oak barrels from the Limousin forest, creating a spirit of remarkable smoothness and depth, a luxury product that would be shipped around the world in the age of exploration. The Caribbean became the birthplace of rum, a spirit made from molasses, the byproduct of sugar production. Enslaved Africans working the plantations discovered, or were forced to discover, that this dark, sticky residue could be fermented and distilled, producing a powerful spirit that became currency in the triangular trade, shipped to New England, where it was distilled again, traded for enslaved people in Africa. The whole horrific system lubricated by alcohol at multiple points. Gin arose in the Netherlands, flavored with juniper and other botanicals, a clear spirit that became wildly popular in England in the 18th century, so popular that it became a social crisis. The gin craze, with cheaply made spirits flooding the markets of London, affordable even to the desperately poor, producing epidemic levels of public drunkenness, violence, and all the social ills that accompany widespread alcohol abuse. The government responded with regulation, with taxation designed to make gin more expensive, with licensing requirements for sellers, slowly bringing the market under control, channeling production toward higher quality, toward the London dry gin that would become the standard, crisp and botanical, mixed into cocktails or drunk with tonic water in the colonies where quinine was needed against malaria. Russia and Poland developed vodka, distilled to high proof and then filtered, traditionally made from grain but sometimes from potatoes, drunk neat and ice cold, an integral part of social rituals, of hospitality, of toasts that bound people together in mutual obligation and celebration. In Mexico, the distillation of agave produced mezcal and its more refined cousin tequila, spirits that captured something of the desert landscape, smoky or bright, earthy or crisp, varying by region and by the variety of agave and by the methods of production, roasting the hearts of the plants in underground pits or in ovens, fermenting the juice, distilling sometimes multiple times. Meanwhile, wine continued its evolution. European colonizers planting vines wherever they settled and the climate allowed, in South Africa and Australia, in California and Chile and Argentina, sometimes successfully, sometimes struggling for generations before the right varieties and techniques were discovered. Before the new terroirs revealed their character, the wines of the New World began as imitations of European styles, but gradually developed their own identities, bolder flavors from hotter climates, different balance of fruit and acid and tannin, different philosophies of winemaking, less constrained by centuries of tradition, more willing to experiment with technology and technique. The phylloxera epidemic of the late 19th century nearly destroyed European viticulture. A tiny aphid accidentally imported from America, attacking the roots of European grapevines, spreading vineyard by vineyard, region by region, devastating the wine industry, forcing replanting on American rootstock that was resistant to the pest, a crisis that reshaped the wine world, that destroyed some varieties forever while creating opportunities for others to rise. Beer underwent its own transformation in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution bringing new technologies, the thermometer and the hydrometer allowing brewers to measure and control their process with precision never before possible. Understanding for the first time the relationship between temperature and sugar content and alcohol production, the isolation and cultivation of pure yeast strains, pioneered by Emil Christian Hansen at the Carlsberg Brewery in Copenhagen, allowed brewers to ensure consistency batch after batch, to eliminate wild yeasts and bacteria that could spoil the beer, to create lagers that were clean and crisp, that could be stored for long periods, that shipped well and scaled to industrial production. Lager became the dominant beer style globally, refreshing and approachable, less challenging than the complex ales that preceded it. Perfect for mass production and mass consumption, for the working classes in the rapidly growing industrial cities, for the beer gardens of Bavaria and the saloons of America, and the pubs of every nation touched by industrialization. Prohibition arrived like a thunderclap in many places, most famously in the United States, where the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages in 1920, the culmination of decades of temperance activism, of moral campaigns against the perceived evils of drink, of genuine concern about the social costs of alcohol abuse, the domestic violence and poverty and health problems that often accompanied heavy drinking. The movement was driven largely by women, by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, by activists who had witnessed firsthand the devastation that alcoholism could bring to families, who saw the saloon as a threat to home and hearth, who believed that banning alcohol would usher in an era of moral improvement, of productivity, of social harmony. But prohibition did not eliminate drinking. It drove it underground, into speakeasies hidden behind unmarked doors, into private homes where bathtub gin was mixed in secret, into the realm of organized crime that grew wealthy and powerful, smuggling liquor across borders from Canada and Mexico, from ships hovering just outside territorial waters, bootleggers racing through the night with their illegal cargo. The quality of available alcohol declined precipitously. Industrial alcohol was redistilled and sold for drinking despite the poisons added to denature it. People went blind from methanol poisoning, died from contaminated spirits. Homemade concoctions were unpredictable in strength and safety, and yet people continued to drink, perhaps even more than before, the forbidden nature of alcohol adding to its allure. Prohibition ended in 1933, repealed by the 21st Amendment, a rare instance of a constitutional amendment being reversed. The experiment judged a failure. The social costs of enforcement and illegal trade deemed worse than the regulated sale of alcohol. But the legacy persisted in the consolidation of the brewing and distilling industries, in the three-tier system of a distribution that separated producers from retailers, in lasting cultural attitudes about alcohol and morality. Other countries had their own experiences with prohibition. Nordic countries implementing various restrictions. Russia attempting to limit vodka consumption during the First World War. Some regions of Canada and Australia banning alcohol at different times, each experiment revealing the difficulty of suppressing through law what is embedded in culture, what serves so many functions beyond simple intoxication. The mid-20th century saw alcohol production become increasingly industrialized and consolidated, small breweries and distilleries absorbed by larger corporations, brands becoming national and then international, standardization replacing regional variation, efficiency and consistency prized over craft and character. Beer became lighter, blander, less distinctive, brewed to offend no one and appeal to the broadest possible market, advertised heavily on the new medium of television, associated with sports and masculinity and leisure, the working man's reward after a hard day, the fuel for weekend recreation and socializing, wine production modernized as well, new technologies allowing precise control over fermentation temperature, stainless steel tanks replacing old wooden vats, scientific understanding of malolactic fermentation and phenolic compounds and the chemistry of aging, some winemakers embracing these tools to make cleaner, more consistent wines, others resisting in favor of traditional methods, arguing that something essential was lost in the pursuit of technical perfection. The French concept of terroir gained prominence. The idea that wine is not just a product of the grape variety and the winemaker's skill, but of the specific place where the vines grow, the soil composition and drainage, the angle of the slope and direction it faces, the microclimate of that particular vineyard, all of this combining to create something that cannot be exactly replicated elsewhere. This notion stood in contrast to the New World approach, at least initially, which tended to emphasize the winemaker's control, the ability to manipulate and perfect, to create wines that expressed a vision rather than simply revealing a place. But gradually even New World producers began to speak of terroir, to seek out distinctive sites, to allow place to speak through their wines. The late 20th century brought a craft revolution, starting in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s. Small breweries reopening, making beer with flavor and character, reviving old styles and inventing new ones, experimenting with hops and malts and yeasts, challenging the dominance of the industrial lagers. This movement began in Britain and in America, spread to Belgium and Germany and Scandinavia, and eventually around the world. Beer enthusiasts seeking out rare and unusual brews, willing to pay premium prices for quality and distinctiveness, creating a market that allowed small producers to thrive, that valued craftsmanship over scale, tradition and innovation over efficiency and consistency. Craft distilling followed a similar path, small batch whiskey and gin and vodka, producers emphasizing local ingredients and traditional methods, aged spirits in small barrels that accelerated the interaction between wood and liquid, distillers becoming celebrities in some cases, their products allocated and sought after, commanding prices that would have seemed absurd just a generation earlier. Wine experienced its own quality revolution, particularly in regions that had been overlooked or undervalued. Napa Valley establishing itself as world-class, Oregon and Washington developing their own identities, New Zealand, Sauvignon Blanc, and Australian Shiraz finding international markets, wines from Chile and Argentina and South Africa competing successfully with European bottles many times their price. The Judgment of Paris in 1976, a blind tasting where California wines bested prestigious French bottles, shattered assumptions about Old World supremacy, opened the market to new possibilities, suggested that great wine could come from anywhere with the right combination of climate and soil and skill and vision. Science continued advancing understanding, researchers identifying the specific compounds responsible for different flavors and aromas, mapping the genome of wine grapes and brewing yeasts, developing new varieties resistant to disease or adapted to changing climates, creating tools that allowed producers to work with unprecedented precision. Yet alongside this scientific progress came a counter-movement toward natural wine, minimal intervention, organic or biodynamic farming, wild yeast fermentation, no added sulfites or other preservatives, wines that were sometimes flawed but always distinctive, that carried the mark of their making, that rejected the polished perfection of modern enology in favor of something more raw, more alive, more connected to the rhythms of nature. The globalization of alcohol culture accelerated, Japanese whiskey gaining recognition and then commanding extraordinary prices, craft's sake finding audiences beyond Japan, mezcal moving from regional Mexican specialty to international phenomenon, wine being produced in China and India and Thailand, beer styles crossing borders and hybridizing, IPAs brewed in England and lagers in Belgium and stouts in Singapore. Health consciousness grew as well, research into the effects of alcohol on the body, yielding complex and sometimes contradictory findings, moderate consumption of red wine, possibly protective for cardiovascular health due to resveratrol and other compounds, but any amount of alcohol also linked to increased cancer risk, to liver damage, to cognitive impairment, to accidents and injuries and social harms. The relationship between societies and alcohol began shifting in many places. drunk driving laws becoming stricter, social acceptance of heavy drinking declining, awareness of alcoholism as a disease rather than a moral failing spreading, treatment programs developing, mutual support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous helping millions, yet consumption continuing, even increasing in some regions while declining in others, younger generations in some countries drinking less than their parents, seeking out quality over quantity, or abstaining entirely, while in other nations, particularly in Asia and Africa, consumption rising with economic development and urbanization, patterns playing out that had been seen before in Europe and America, alcohol becoming more available and more affordable as societies industrialized and traditional structures weakened, the science of addiction advanced, neurobiology revealing how alcohol affects the brain's reward systems, how repeated exposure changes neural pathways, how some individuals are more vulnerable than others due to genetics, to early experiences, to co-occurring mental health conditions, understanding growing but the problem persisting, millions struggling with dependence, families disrupted, lives lost to the consequences of a substance that is simultaneously ancient and ordinary, dangerous and deeply woven into the fabric of human culture. Marketing became more sophisticated, brands creating identities and lifestyles, associating their products with aspiration and belonging, craft producers telling stories of heritage and authenticity, large corporations buying up smaller brands while maintaining the appearance of independence, the business of alcohol maturing into a global industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually, touching agriculture and manufacturing and hospitality and retail, employing millions, generating tax revenue that governments depend upon. Climate change began affecting production, warming temperatures pushing viable growing regions for grapes poleward and to higher elevations, traditional wine areas becoming too hot, cool climate regions suddenly able to ripen varieties that previously struggled, precipitation patterns shifting, droughts in some places and floods in others, producers adapting or relocating, ancient appellations facing existential questions about their future. And so I find myself thinking about continuity, about how this story of fermentation and transformation stretches in an unbroken line from those first accidental discoveries in Neolithic villages to the bottles on shelves today, how the fundamental process remains unchanged even as our understanding and our techniques have evolved beyond what those early brewers could have imagined. The yeast doing its invisible work now is the same organism that converted sugars 10,000 years ago, the same biological imperative, the same metabolic pathway, consuming and excreting, living and dying in the sweet liquid we provide, creating as a byproduct of its existence the compound that has shaped so much of human history. There is something profound in this, in the way we have partnered with these microscopic fungi, cultivating them, protecting them, creating environments where they can thrive, learning to read the signs of their activity, the bubbling and foaming, the gradual clearing, the changing aroma that signals transformation is complete. This relationship exists at a scale we cannot see, billions of individual organisms working in concert, each one a complete living thing with its own cellular machinery, yet their collective action producing something that affects us at the level of consciousness, of culture, of civilization itself. I think about how alcohol has always existed at boundaries, between nature and culture, between the wild processes of fermentation and the controlled techniques of brewing and winemaking, between the sacred and the profane, between medicine and poison, between social lubricant and social destroyer. It is never just one thing, never simple, always carrying multiple meanings depending on context, on quantity, on intention, the wine poured in libation to the gods, the beer shared among friends, the whiskey that numbs pain or celebrates victory, the champagne that marks beginnings, the sake that seals agreements, each instance the same substance performing different cultural work. And there is the paradox at the heart of it, that the same drink can bring people together and tear them apart, can facilitate connection and enable isolation, can be part of joyous celebration and desperate escape, can represent sophistication and loss of control, hospitality and addiction, tradition and destruction. The question of why humans have maintained this relationship despite the costs, despite the hangovers and the health risks and the social problems and the individual tragedies, is perhaps answered by the question itself, because alcohol does so many things, serves so many purposes, operates at so many levels simultaneously. It is calories and hydration in societies where water was unsafe and food scarce. It is currency and commodity in economic systems. It is offering and sacrament in religious practice. It is marker of status and expression of taste. It is social ritual and personal pleasure. It is performance enhancer and performance destroyer. It is truth serum and forgetfulness. It is courage and recklessness. Perhaps no other substance has been asked to do so much, to carry so much meaning, to serve so many functions across so many cultures over so many millennia. And perhaps that is why it persists, because it is woven so deeply into the fabric of what it means to be human, to gather, to celebrate, to mourn, to mark the passages of time and life. I find myself thinking about the knowledge embedded in traditional practices, in the timing of harvest and the methods of fermentation, in the recipes passed down through generations, in the songs that preserve brewing instructions, in the rituals that surround drinking, all of this accumulated wisdom about how to work with these processes, how to achieve desired results, how to avoid disasters. This knowledge was hard-won, built up through countless experiments, successes and failures, through attention to detail and patience, and the willingness to learn from what went wrong, through sharing observations and comparing notes, through the slow refinement that comes from doing something again and again with slight variations until excellence emerges. And much of this knowledge is ecological, about the relationship between climate and crop, between soil and flavor, about the microorganisms that live in a particular place, the wild yeasts that settle on grape skins in one valley but not another, the bacteria that contribute to the character of a beer or a wine, the invisible ecosystem that makes each place's products distinctive. Modern science can explain these things now, can sequence the DNA of local yeast strains, can analyze soil composition and correlate it with flavor compounds, can map the geographic distribution of microorganisms, but the knowledge existed first in practice, in the hands and tongues of people who worked with these materials, who learned to recognize quality and to replicate conditions that produced it. There is also the aesthetic dimension, the appreciation of alcohol as more than just its effects, the cultivation of taste and discernment, the language that has developed to describe flavors and aromas and textures, earthy and floral and spicy and mineral, smooth and harsh and balanced and complex, the whole vocabulary of sensory evaluation. This aesthetic appreciation reaches back centuries to Greek symposiasts debating the merits of different wines, to Chinese poets celebrating the clarity of their rice wine, to Persian scholars writing treatises on distillation, to medieval monks rating vintages, an unbroken tradition of paying attention, of finding pleasure and meaning in subtle differences, of developing expertise and sharing it. And there are the rituals, the toast that punctuates gathering, the clinking of glasses, the pouring of rounds, the buying of drinks as gesture of friendship or gratitude or apology, the ceremonial first sip, the final nightcap, all these small structured moments that use alcohol to create social bonds, to acknowledge relationships, to mark transitions. These rituals vary across cultures, but share common elements. The sharing itself as important as the substance shared. The act of drinking together as statement of trust and solidarity. The recognition that to drink with someone is to enter into a form of communion, to become vulnerable together, to lower guards and cross boundaries that usually separate. Perhaps this is part of alcohol's enduring appeal, that it facilitates a kind of temporary community, a loosening of the usual constraints that keep people isolated, a warmth that spreads through the group as inhibitions fade and conversation flows more easily, laughter coming more readily, connections forming that might not otherwise happen. But always there is the other side, the excess that tips celebration into chaos, the dependence that turns pleasure into compulsion, the harm done under influence, words spoken that cannot be unsaid, actions taken that cannot be undone, the morning after with its physical and emotional reckoning. The history of alcohol is also a history of this tension, of societies trying to find the balance, to preserve the benefits while limiting the harms, through law and custom and education, through taxation and regulation, through moral suasion and medical intervention, never quite succeeding, but continuing to try, because the substance is too valuable to abandon, but too dangerous to ignore. And perhaps there is wisdom in that continuing effort, in the recognition that this is not something to be solved once and for all, but something to be managed, negotiated, balanced differently in different times and places, according to different values and different assessments of risk and benefit. The story continues. New chapters being written even now, new techniques being developed, new products being created, old traditions being revived or reinvented, the craft movement growing in some places while consolidation continues in others, health consciousness rising while consumption patterns shift, climate change forcing adaptations while technology offers new possibilities. But beneath all this change, the fundamental thing remains constant, the transformation of sugar into alcohol, the patient work of yeast in the darkness, the slow alchemy that turns grain and grape and agave into something that has accompanied humanity through its entire journey from scattered bands to global civilization. And there is something almost comforting in that continuity, in knowing that the beer drunk in a modern craft brewery has its ancestors in the thick brews of ancient Sumer, that the wine poured at a contemporary dinner table connects to rituals performed in Egyptian temples and Greek symposia and medieval monasteries, that every bottle and every glass carries within it this vast history, this deep relationship between humans and the processes of fermentation. I let my thoughts settle like sediment in a fermenting vessel, like the quiet that comes after the bubbling stops and the work is done. And I think about how appropriate it is that this story has no clear ending, because it continues in every vineyard and brewery and distillery, in every toast and every sip, in the ongoing dance between nature and culture, between control and surrender, between the wild yeast floating on the air and the careful hands that guide the transformation. The vessels wait in the darkness, in cellars and caves and climate-controlled warehouses, in oak barrels and steel tanks and clay amphorae, holding their precious liquids as time does its slow work, as flavors mellow and integrate and evolve, as something new emerges from the marriage of ingredients and technique and patience. And perhaps that patience is part of the lesson, that some transformations cannot be rushed, that we must wait for the process to unfold at its own pace, that hurrying ruins everything, that the best things come to those who can sit with the uncertainty, who can trust that what is happening in the dark is happening as it should. The night deepens, the story settles into silence, and somewhere fermentation continued, invisible, inevitable, ancient as the first fallen fruit and fresh as tomorrow's batch, the yeast consuming and converting, creating and transforming, doing what it has always done, what it will always do, as long as there is sweetness and warmth and time. The thoughts drift now, like bubbles rising through fermenting liquid, like the gradual clearing that comes when the work is complete, like the quiet satisfaction of transformation achieved. And the story fades, soft as candlelight in a cellar, gentle as the settling of leaves, peaceful as the moment before sleep, when all the words have been said, and all that remains is the gentle breathing, the slow rhythm, the deep rest.